Hey guys, Serendi here. Here is what if Bell Cranel became a student of the Dragonborn. The Dragonborn had been living in seclusion for over 30 years after his friends and family had died of old age. Until one day Akatosh comes to him with an offer. A new world to see, new students to teach, maybe even a new family to build in a world whose fate doesn't rest on his shoulders. It sounds like the perfect cross between retirement and a new adventure. Who could say no? Hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 1. The sun shone brilliantly in the sky, illuminating the fluffy white clouds below. They swirled lazily around the high mountain top, forming a sea of billowing white that obscured the top of the mountain from view, or, in one particular case, the view of the ground from the mountain peak. At the highest point on the mountain, known to all as the throat of the world, sat two strange structures. One was a crumbling wall inscribed with words in an ancient tongue, unknown to all but a few. The other was a small stone house with a forge attached that seemed out of place on the remote mountaintop. Near the house was a winding path that disappeared into the fog as it led down the mountain. Sitting on the very edge of the peak with his legs dangling over the precipice was the house's sole resident. He appeared to most to be a human in his late 40s or early 50s, though his true age was more than double that. He was dressed causally in a simple tunic and breeches with fine leather boots, seemingly unbothered by the cold of the snowy mountain top. His shoulder-length black hair, graying at the sides, blew softly in the breeze, held back only by the stone of the ancient wall against which the man rested. The man's close-cropped black beard, also showing flecks of gray, fluttered as the man sighed and closed his eyes. No matter how majestic any view could ever be, once you'd seen it enough times, it would be as uninteresting as sitting and staring at dirt for hours on end, and this man had seen every view the mountain had to offer. He'd sat and watched the weather and the lands below more times than he could count in the 30 years he had lived on the mountain. Though how routine the view had become, it never failed to awaken some memory or other of the times the man had spent wandering the lands of Skyrim that stretched out below him. He would remember his days tracking down stolen books with his classmates from the College of Winterhold, or the weeks he spent tracking bandits and animals through the wild alongside his shield brothers and sisters from the Companions. His favorite memories to revisit were the ones of his family and his time spent teaching his children along with hundreds of other students the wonders of magic, combat, and survival. Though these were the memories he remembered most fondly, they were not what the majority of the world remembered him for. The lands of Skyrim and beyond, across every region of Tamriel, remembered him best for the years he spent hunting dragons and other creatures that threatened the world. They remembered him for his defeat of Alduin the World Eater, his victory over Harkon the Vampire Lord, and for how he led the armies of the Empire to victory over the Aldemari Dominion. Few in the world below even remembered his name. The legends and stories told about him simply referred to him by his title, Dragonborn. The man stirred at that thought. Dragonborn. He'd been called that by so many people that it might as well have been his name. That, or the dozens of other titles he'd held over the years. Listener, Guild Master, Harbinger, Archmage, Commander, General, Advisor, Thane, and so many others he could no longer remember. So few had ever used his real name that it had become something special. Now that he thought about it, there was only one person who had never called him anything but his name. Mwiri, his darling wife, had never failed to greet him the same way every time he returned home to her from some epic adventure. "Welcome home, Torin. How was your trip?" she would say, before kissing him lightly and leading him into the house. Torin. Yes, that was his name. The true name of the Dovahkiin. The name the legendary last Dragonborn preferred. The name that Tamriel had forgotten, though his legend lived on. It wasn't a huge surprise that the world had forgotten his name, considering both the fact that so few had ever used it and how long it had been since he'd truly interacted with the world. It had been over 90 years since the last of his great feats, the destruction of the Thalmor and the Aldemari Dominon, had occurred. Once the war was won and Tamriel had been united under the banner of the Emir, Torin had returned to Skyrim to take up his positions as Archmage of the College of Winterhold and Harbinger of the Companions. He'd held both positions full-time for nearly 20 years before leaving the posts to his daughters, Lucia as Harbinger and Sophie as Archmage. It had taken a lot of badgering before he left those posts to take up an advisory position in the Imperial City as the right hand of the Emperor. He'd served as an Imperial advisor for another 20 years, and through 2 emperors, before retiring back to Whiterun to take care of his wife who, in her mid-80s, was well past the expected lifespan of a human in Tamriel. He'd spent 3 hard but loving years taking care of her until she had finally died at 88. That was 53 years ago now, and had marked the beginning of his withdrawal from the world. After Mwiri had died, Torin moved to a remote homestead in the swamps of Jalmarch, with his only frequent visitors being his daughters. When they had finally died of old age, he had lost his last living connection to the world around him. After burying Lucia, the last of the girls to die, He'd packed his bags and made his way up the 7,000 steps. He stopped briefly at the monastery of High Hrothgar to speak with the newest generation of greybeards before continuing on to the peak of the throat of the world. He had lived on the peak for 30 years now and hadn't had a visitor in nearly 20, though he knew that the greybeards were still alive. He could hear their shouts from his home. The only people he spoke to know were himself and the gods above. Not that they're listening, he muttered to himself. I must have spoken to the gods 1,000 times at shrines, temples, even the middle of the wilds, but I've never gotten a response. Not even from Father Akatosh. Not since the day he made me Dovahkian. We are not supposed to speak with mortals directly, my son. It usually causes more problems than it solves, said a deep voice that startled Tauren. Though he had only heard it once, it was a voice that Tauren knew well. Akatosh, the father of the dragons, chief of the divines, and Tauren's own father. He looked to his right to observe the figure that had appeared there. The form Akatosh had taken looked nearly identical to Tauren himself, though with pure silver hair and dragon scales covering every inch of skin. Bormahu, he said quietly. I did not expect to hear your voice again, especially not after nearly a century of silence. To see you in physical form is even stranger. After a moment's pause, he stood and faced the only being he could truly call father. Why now? After so many years, why do you appear before me now? I bring an offer to you, my son, Akatosh said, gazing out at the sea of clouds. I am aware that you secluded yourself here to avoid the people below, to avoid both their awe at your accomplishments and their fear of the power you wield. It was true. Part of why he had retreated from the world was the way the people of Tamriel looked at him. Even his own students sometimes gazed at him with a mix of awe and fear. His daughters were the last people he could remember that had actually treated him like a person. I offer to take you away from this world, to take you on to another world where you may escape from your reputation. A true retirement. You could even become a teacher again. I am aware of how much you have missed it. Tauren stared in silence for a moment before turning to face the clouds once more. I didn't know that any worlds existed beyond Nirn and the Oblivion realms, he said. How did it come to be? You are aware, of course, of how the Etiada created Mundus and eventually became the Edra, Daedra, and mortal races, Akatosh explained. What few mortals know, however, is that a great many of the Etiada had nothing to do with the creation of Mundus at all and chose to create a world of their own which they call Genkai. And you wish to send me to this world? Tauren asked. To Genkai. That is my offer to you, my son, Akatosh smiled. The gods of that world have descended from the heavenly plane to live among their mortal children. Most have taken mortals into their service in groups they call familia. The gods do this by granting the mortals a blessing called a falna, which allows the mortals to grow in strength as well as learn powerful skills and magical abilities. The god turned and continued to speak as he walked around the front of the word wall. The monsters of Genkai come from a central point called the dungeon. The best way for blessed mortals to increase their abilities or level is to delve into the dungeon and fight the monsters within. To that end, most of the gods and their familia have congregated around the entrance to the dungeon. They call the city they have created Rio. If I were to accept, how would I get there? Tauren asked. Would I be able to bring anything with me, or would I have to start over? You will be able to keep all that you have collected over the years save for the Edric and Daedric artifacts you have hidden around the world, Akatosh said as he turned to face Tauren. I will have Zenithar convert your gold into Valis, the currency of that world. As for how you will get there, he gestured towards the ancient word wall. I will create a portal here to transport you to Genkai. Once there, you will never be able to return to Nirn, nor hear from me again. And what of my powers? Will I be able to keep them in this new world, or must I find a god to serve in that world, start over from the beginning? This is meant to be a retirement, my son, not a new quest. Akatosh smiled. I will give you a temporary falna using my own divine energy, but, he paused. If you wish to keep your powers, you must join the familia of a god who is native to that world within a year of your arrival. If you do not, your powers will begin to fade. Would I be forced to delve into this dungeon of theirs, or could I spend my days teaching the members of the familia I join all that I am able? That is up to you, my son, and the god you choose to join. The doom of this new world is not yours to bear. It rests on the shoulders of others, though you may involve yourself if you choose to do so. Tauren stood in silent thought for a moment. Seemed like a good deal. He had dearly missed both normal interactions with people and the experience of being a teacher. That he could regain both, plus keep the skills and riches he had worked so hard to obtain, was a very hard thing to pass up. There was just one thing that stopped him, though. A thought he had to voice. What of Nirn? He asked quietly. Will Nirn be all right if I leave? Akatosh smiled. Eventually this cycle will end, and the next Kulpa will begin. The wheel of time never stops turning, and all shall eventually meet its end. To answer your question, though, your actions have brought about the beginning of a golden age. Entire generations of men and mare shall live and die without ever knowing the horrors of war thanks to your actions. Though monsters still roam and Daedra still scheme, Nirn will survive in your absence. You've done the hard part. Now it is time to rest. In that case, Torin grinned. I accept your offer, Bormahu. Akatosh smiled again. Good. He gestured to Torin's Hazu. You need not worry about your gear. I will ensure that it and your money are stored within that magical storage bag you created. It shall be beside you when you awaken on the other side of the portal. Thank you, Bormahu, Torin said gratefully, before turning to face the word wall. I am ready. Good luck, my son, Akatosh said before turning to the word wall. Viusdalinich Akatosh shouted as a swirling portal appeared within the word wall. Torin nodded at his father and, with one last look at his house and the swirling clouds around the throat of the world, he stepped through the portal and into the unknown. Chapter 2. As Torin slowly returned to consciousness, he began to notice a soft warmth on his face. His ears picked up the sounds of birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the soft crackling of a low fire. He opened his eyes slowly, the silver orbs gazing out at the new world around him. Torin sat with his back against a tree, looking out into a small clearing. All around him he could hear the sounds of a forest coming to life. A soft morning light filtered through the trees and bathed his face in a warm glow. Near the center of the clearing, a small fire was slowly dying, and at his feet lay a well-made but worn leather pack. The pack caught his attention. It was his. He'd spent weeks working the leather and enchanting it with the help of Jargo and Brailna. It was enchanted to be far larger on the inside than on the outside and, once opened, it showed a magical display of what was contained within. While packs of that nature were not uncommon among the wealthier adventurers of Tamriel, Torin's was special. It was far larger on the inside than the normal pack, capable of holding practically everything he had ever owned and had required several difficult enchantments to make it work. He pulled the pack towards him and flipped open the top. The magical display popped up and he started browsing through the contents. Akatosh had been honest when he said he would make sure all of his gear was stored within. He chuckled lightly when he saw that Akatosh had even stored his plates and cups in the bag. As he sorted through the contents, he lamented that he hadn't bothered to restock on his smithing and alchemy supplies while living on the mountain. He had plenty of potions, weapons, and armor, but he was running very low on the materials needed to make more. Hopefully they wouldn't be too difficult to find. Though, he thought as he looked at the display's money counter, I doubt it'd be too hard to buy what I need. The counter clearly showed that his rather substantial fortune had been converted into the currency of his new world. He was honestly impressed by the converted number. 132 billion valis. The exchange rate must be insane. I only had a few 100 million septims. Shaking off his thoughts of money, Torin turned his attention to what really mattered. His armor and weapons. As his father had said, the Edric and Daedric artifacts he had collected were missing, but that didn't matter much. He hadn't really used any of them. Certainly not ones like the Ebony Blade or the Mace of Molag Bal. He'd used Dawnbreaker for a while but had put it aside after he had learned to make, in his own opinion, better weapons. He could see both his travel armor and his true battle armor marked for easy removal, along with his preferred weapons. I should probably get my armor on, he thought. You never know when you might be ambushed. I doubt anything here could hurt me, but better to be cautious. He quickly withdrew his travel armor and his weapons. His travel armor was a combined modification of his Black Dawnguard and Master Thief armors with a knee-length leather duster thrown over the top. It had been years since he'd worn his armor, but his muscles easily remembered the process of putting it on. After straightening out his duster, he pulled out his weapons and examined them. His sword was a masterwork of his own creation. Named Stormcaller, it was a classic hand and a half-broadsword with a blackened leather hilt and a deep fuller running up the blade. It boasted an enchantment for chaos damage and vampiric drain. He quickly attached it to his sword belt on his left side before strapping the Bait of Woe to his other side and his modified ebony hunting bow to his back. His travel pack had an attached quiver that would constantly replace arrows, so long as there were some in the pack. Now that he was armed and armored, he took stock of himself. He could feel his dragon's blood pounding through his veins, and the magic surging beneath his skin. Akatosh had mentioned that his powers might fade if he didn't join with one of the gods of this world. He supposed that did make some sense. His magical and physical abilities would likely be unaffected, but he could already feel a change within his soul. Akatosh had quite literally created his soul, and he had been able to feel a connection to the god since the very moment he became aware of who he was. Though he could still feel the connection, it was different. Muted. I suppose that is what Bormahu meant, he thought. In order to keep powers not of this world, like my Thursdayum, they must be anchored to this world by one of its gods. My magical and physical abilities are unaffected, but the Thursdayum is a semi-divine power created by Akatosh and Kine, gods who do not exist in this world. Turning to face the small fire, Torin let out a piercing shout. Fo Krah Dian. The frost breath shout rippled across the clearing, covering everything in a thick layer of frost and easily dousing the fire. Well, he said after his voice recovered. It seems the strength of my Thu'um is unaffected, even if the connection is muted. Turning to his pack once again, Torin pulled out the only other thing marked for quick removal. Pulling out the unfamiliar scroll, he unrolled it to discover it was a map of this new world. It even had important landmarks labeled though. If the red circle cheekily labeled "You are here" was accurate, he was in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. He didn't know Akatosh had a sense of humor. After a minute of searching, he found the city that Akatosh had mentioned and, looking at the scale of the map, considered the distance. If I summon Shadowmere and really sprint, I could be there in around a month, he thought. Though I don't see why I should hurry. I have a full year to go before I have to worry about anything, and I doubt it would be hard to find a familia to join. Having decided on a direct route, but a leisurely pace, Torin turned in the direction of Orario and set off on his new journey. 1 week later. The past week had been one of the most relaxing walks Torin could remember. He'd cleared the forest before noon on the day of his arrival and had found a road that led in the right direction before nightfall. So far, he hadn't seen any other people, but he had walked past several forks in the road and a few obvious campsites for travelers. Even the few monsters he'd encountered were little more than pests, easily brushed aside with low-level magic. Akatosh had said that the strongest opponents were to be found in the dungeon, but they were still surprisingly weak. He was surprised at the crystals they dropped though. They seemed to be some kind of soul gem, and he was even able to use one to charge the enchantment on his sword. It barely added to it, but considering the strength of the monster it came from, that wasn't a surprise. According to his map, he had started on the outskirts of the forest to the south of the Alv Mountains, near the coast, and there was practically nothing between him and the city of Orario save for a few small villages that were a bit off the beaten track. Because of how empty his path seemed to be, he was honestly surprised to hear the sound of fighting as he crested a small hill. Looking into the shallow valley below him, he spotted what appeared to be a white-haired human boy, no older than 15, trying to fend off 3 goblins with a knife. Torin drew his bow, intending to help the boy but paused before he could fire. The boy had managed to kill one of the goblins. Surprisingly agile, the boy had managed to roll under the goblin's club and bring his knife up and into its chest. Still, agile or not, the boy was obviously untrained and outmatched. Torin drew back his bow and fired a quick shot into the eye of one of the 2 remaining goblins. The final goblin, distracted by the sudden death of its companion, was unable to react in time to stop the boy from knocking it over and plunging his knife into the goblin's neck. Half jogging down the hill, Torin waved to the boy as he picked himself up off the ground. "Hello there," he called as he ran up. "Are you all right? They didn't get you, did they?" "No, sir," the boy said as he dusted himself off. "Just a few scrapes from rolling in the dirt." The boy finally looked up, his red eyes widening as he took in Torin's armor and weapons. "Thank you for your help, sir. I'm not sure I could have beaten them on my own." "Are you an adventurer?" Torin chuckled. "I suppose I am." He extended his hand to the boy. "The name's Torin." "Bell Cranel, sir," the now-named boy said as he shook Torin's hand. "What familia are you a member of?" Bell asked, his eyes shining. "Well, for now at least, I suppose you could say I'm a member of the Akatosh familia," Torin replied. "At least until I get to Orario, that is." "Are you looking to join a new familia in the city, Mr. Torin?" the boy asked excitedly. "I am indeed. What about you, boy? What are you doing out in the middle of nowhere like this?" The boy seemed to almost vibrate with excitement. "I just left my village. I'm headed to Orario to become an adventurer, sir." That made Torin smile. If he and the boy were headed to the same place, they might as well stick together. It had been a long time since he'd had a traveling companion, especially one so young. He'd missed the experience of traveling with and training new talent, and judging by the way the boy had fought the goblins, he'd need a lot of training. "Well then," he said, patting the boy on the shoulder. "If we're going to the same place, it makes sense that we should stick together. That is, if you don't mind traveling with an old man like me." That just seemed to excite the boy even further. "That would be wonderful, sir," he said happily. "I didn't think I'd get to meet any real adventurers until I made it to the city." "No, I don't suppose you would," Torin said as they collected Bell's bag and the stones the goblins had dropped. "I doubt many adventurers would have much reason to be out here. What made you decide to be an adventurer anyway?" he asked as they set off down the road. "My grandpa," Bell said. "Before he died, he used to tell me amazing stories about adventurers and legendary heroes. I've wanted to be just like the heroes in the stories, ever since I was little." "A hero, eh?" Torin asked wryly. The boy seemed a bit naive and a bit too trusting. He supposed it wouldn't do much harm, but he was glad it was him the boy had met and not someone unscrupulous. "Being a hero is not an easy thing to accomplish. Are you sure you're up for it?" Bell seemed to consider that for a moment. I don't really know, he said softly. But I have to try. The boy perked up, a sudden spark in his eyes. Well, Torin thought. If nothing else, the kid is definitely determined. Bell spent the next few hours regaling Torin with the stories his grandfather had told him. Overall, it seemed to Torin that the boy's grandfather had been a kind man, if a little perverted. Though why the man wanted Bell to build a harem of girls he'd rescued in the dungeon was a mystery to him. Mwiri had been more than enough for him. They made camp just before the sun went down. As they sat around the fire, eating the remains of a deer Torin had caught a couple days before, Bell asked, "So, why are you looking for a new familia, Mr. Torin? Did yours not want to move to the city?" Torin considered his answer for a moment. "No, that's not really the case," he answered eventually. "I was Akatosh's only true follower, and he is no longer present in this world. I'm headed to Ororio to retire." "Retire?" Bell asked, surprised. "Yes, you see," Bell Torin leaned back against a log. "I am much stronger than most adventurers who live outside the city. I am also much older than I look, thanks to a quirk of my biology. I'm headed to the city to find a familia and spend the rest of my days training new adventurers." That made Bell sit up straight. "You mean like me?" he asked, hopefully. Torin chuckled. "Yes, Bell, like you. In fact," he gestured towards Bell's dagger, "I wouldn't mind giving you a few tips while we travel. Give you a bit of a head start on what you need to learn." Bell excitedly scrambled to grab his dagger. Chapter 3. Torin. Torin stared intensely at the city that was slowly growing in the distance as the carriage rattled forward. He glanced to his side to see Bell practically bouncing in his seat, his eyes beaming as he stared out at the city. The two had hitched a ride with a merchant caravan when passing through a village about a week ago. Before that, they'd spent nearly a month and a half walking down a mostly deserted road. Torin eyed Bell and had to smile. He'd grown rather fond of the kid over the last month and a half. After that first night, whenever they had stopped for the evenings, he and Bell would spend an hour or two sparring. Well, perhaps sparring is the wrong word. He'd spent a couple hours every night teaching Bell how not to kill himself with his own weapon. Although a shoddy iron dagger was all Bell had with him, Torin had a few unenchanted iron and steel weapons with him that were a good level for a beginner to use. For the first few days, he'd had Bell try out each of the different weapons to find the one that best suited him. After Bell had managed to nearly bash in his own skull with a warhammer and nearly emasculate himself with a short axe, it became rather apparent that daggers and long knives were best suited to the boy's fighting style. Once that had become apparent, he'd replaced Bell's beat-up old dagger with one of his nicer steel daggers. The dagger was actually pretty old, being one of the first weapons he'd ever forged back in his youth, after finally convincing Arnjorn to teach him how to make his own. Growing up in the Dark Brotherhood tended to make one rather obsessed with knives. Thankfully, he'd grown out of that after he left the Brotherhood in Nazir's hands and started trying to learn how to be a good person. Well, mostly good. Since the dagger was something he'd forged when he was first starting, it was a perfect level for Bell to use. He didn't want to give the kid a powerful, enchanted weapon. Giving a beginner a powerful weapon right off the bat was just begging for trouble, and he didn't have the tools or the materials needed to make a weapon that would grow with him. He also hadn't been able to armor the boy since all the armor he had was made for someone his own size, and, again, he didn't have the tools needed to resize it. Nor did he really want to. All the armor he had was just too good or too heavily enchanted for someone of Bell's level. Having ridiculously strong armor from the start would be detrimental to his growth. The kid was better off finding a blacksmith in the city and making a contract with them. After giving Bell a weapon that didn't look like it was about to shatter, the two of them had spent the evening sparring. He'd shown Bell the proper way to hold his knife, both in a normal and a reverse grip, and helped him figure out how best to use his natural agility. They'd spent their days trading stories and going over topics that Bell needed to know if he wanted to survive. He had even let Bell handle any monster encounters, once he was sure the kid wouldn't get himself killed by being stupid. One of the things he'd been trying to beat into Bell's skull from the start was the importance of healing items or spells, and how best to run away if he was overwhelmed. Survival for him and whatever team he formed was lesson number 1, and Bell seemed to have learned it rather well. The kid was a quick learner, especially with decent gear and a proper teacher. When he wasn't teaching Bell, the two would trade stories. He told the kid about some of his adventures, careful not to name places since he didn't really want to answer any questions about where he was from just yet. Bell would talk about his grandfather and his village, or he would recite the tales his grandfather had told him. He was especially fond of recounting heroic tales. It was through Bell's stories that he learned about the myths and legends of this new world. All legends contain a decent amount of truth, so it was good information to have. Some of the stories did raise a few concerns though, especially the one about the one-eyed black dragon. No, he shook his head. It's impossible for that thing to be Alduin. I killed him over a century ago. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of driving the remade, shout forged, Dragonbane through that bastard's eye. Even after all these years, he could still hear Alduin's screams. Zuyuan Slad. Zuyu Nis Oblin. Was it possible he had somehow reformed in this world? It shouldn't be possible, and yet, he shook his head again. He would go crazy wondering about possibilities. Better to let it lie until he could find more information, preferably by asking one of the gods in the city. And if Alduin really has reformed, well, he fought back a small smirk. I've beaten him twice before. I can do it again. Shaking off his thoughts of the winged menace, he turned his attention to the others riding in the carriage. They were all normal merchants, though they belonged to races he'd never seen before. Their driver's cat ears, the dog ears and tail of the child bouncing on the lap of what had to be his mother in the carriage behind them. He wondered if Herson had had a hand in creating them. Could Herson even reach this world? He wasn't sure. Sitting next to Bell was a diminutive figure who was apparently called a Paolum, and the leader of the caravan was a dwarf. Not a dwemer, which would have been astonishing, but a genuine dwarf. There were even varieties of elves, though they looked a little different to the ones he was used to. He observed the adventurers that the merchants had hired to guard the caravan. They were all level 1s, save for their leader who was level 2. He was shocked at how weak they seemed. Then again, the natural level of strength for people in this world seemed to be generally lower than it had been on Nirn. The average person in Tamriel seemed to be about as strong a mid-range level 1 adventurer. Judging by the leader of their escorts, the average officer of the Imperial Legion would be able to pass for a level 2 adventurer. If that progression continued, then he could safely assume that warriors like the Companions or Mages from Winterhold and the Synods would be in the level 3 to 5 range of strength. Master Mages and members of the Circle would likely be in the level 6 to 8 range. People like himself, the Ebony Warrior, Ulfric, or the Greybeards would likely be in the level 9 to 10 range, but he wasn't sure. According to the merchants, the current highest level adventurer was level 7, but there had been up to level 9 in the past. He was curious to see what level this Falna thing would say he was. He looked at Bell again. Compared to even the level 1 adventurers, he didn't look like much. Visually at least. The kid had a crazy amount of potential if you knew what to look for, but if the familias of Orario judged acceptance based on the appearance of strength instead of the potential for strength, the kid would have a hard time finding a familia alone. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, he thought. Any god that accepts him as he is likely to be kind enough to be worth following. That, or desperate enough to accept anybody. I can work with both, so I'll stick with the kid. It wouldn't do to abandon my first student in this world, after all. Bell could barely contain his excitement as the carriage pulled to a stop in front of the gates to Orario. Finally, he was going to be an adventurer. Okay. Bell, calm down, he thought. Remember what Mr. Torrens said. Always keep a level head, Bell. Being panicky or overeager might be different, but they'll both get you in trouble if you're not careful. The last month and a half traveling with Mr. Torren had been incredible for Bell. He'd learned so much, from how to most efficiently pack his bag, to how best to arrange his weapon in case of an ambush, and even how to fight. It seemed like Mr. Torren knew everything there was to know about being an adventurer and was teaching it all to Bell. Let me handle customs, kid, Mr. Torren said as he walked up to the gatehouse. Bell had never done this before, so it was kind of interesting. Name? The bored-looking official asked. He was dressed totally differently to the guards standing near the gate. They were dressed in slightly revealing clothing and were all wearing these weird masks. But the official was dressed in a black suit with a white shirt. Torren, Mr. Torren said. And the kid is Bell Cranel. Temporary visit or permanent residence? The official asked. Permanent residence, Torren replied. Bell couldn't help it. I'm going to be an adventurer, he blurted out, excitedly. Really? The official looked skeptical. He turned back to Mr. Torren. Are you a member of a familia? I am, but the kid isn't, he said. Familia name? Akatosh familia. The guard looked up, confused. Never heard of that one. Will they be joining you? No, Mr. Torren shook his head. I am looking for a new familia to join. All right then. The guard looked at his papers. The entrance fee for permanent residence is 3,000 valis per person. Once you've paid that, you can go on in, it's up to you to find lodging. Bell went to reach for his money bag but was stopped by Mr. Torren. That won't be an issue. It's 6,000 valis in total, right? He asked as he handed over the money. The guard paused for a moment to count it. Everything looks to be in order, he said. Welcome to Orario and good luck. Bell was beaming as they stepped out of the gatehouse and into the labyrinth city. Chapter 4. Bell sighed as he sat dejectedly against a random brick wall in some back alley. He'd been rejected again. He had been so excited when he and Mr. Torren had first arrived in the city 2 weeks ago. Mr. Torren was even paying for a really nice room for the two of them at an inn near the market square. Flashback. All right, Bell, Mr. Torren had said as he set his pack down on one of the beds. This is the deal. I'll pay for our rooms. but it's up to you to find a familia for us to join. Us? Bell had asked, confused but slightly hopeful. Mr. Torin had grinned. Yes, I've been teaching you for almost 2 months now, and to be honest, I've grown rather fond of you. That makes you my student, and I'm not in the habit of abandoning my students. I'll join whatever familia you do, but it's up to you to find one that will accept you. Bell had been ecstatic. Mr. Torin was really nice and had been teaching him a ton about being an adventurer. He'd been worried that Mr. Torin wouldn't keep teaching him after they'd arrived in the city. To find out that he wanted to join the same familia as Bell? That was wonderful. Don't you worry, Mr. Torin, Bell had said happily. I'll find us a familia in no time. Flashback end. Bell scoffed at the memory. No time, yeah right? He thought miserably. He'd run right out of the inn with a list of familias and their locations. He'd tried Freya, Loki, Ganesha, Apollo, Soma, and half a dozen others. Even merchant ones like Dien Sect and Hephaestus. They had all rejected him. He hadn't even met with a single god yet. He kept getting turned away at the gates, or at least kicked out by the door guards. With each day of rejection behind him, he'd miserably wandered back to the inn and told Mr. Torin about his failure. Mr. Torin had tried to cheer him up. It's not that big of a surprise that you're having trouble. You've got lots of potential, but to most you look like you're just a kid. Don't give up though, he'd said. You'll find a familia eventually. Even if it's small, you'll find one that'll accept you for who you are. That had helped a little, but it didn't really make him feel any better. Mr. Torin had been spending his days in the library doing research. When Bell had asked what he was researching, he'd said mostly just basic information. Important laws, how policing works, that kind of thing. I don't want to get in trouble because I didn't know I was breaking the law. Ignorance of the law usually doesn't hold up in court. That had been a bit confusing, but not breaking the law sounded like a good thing, so he supposed it was important. Mr. Torin had even told him about some of the things he'd found so he wouldn't accidentally get in trouble. Like how the Ganesha familia oversaw public safety and policing, but the guild was the organization that actually creates and enforces the laws. Bell's head dropped into his hands as he tried not to cry. Mr. Torin had been so nice and so patient, but all Bell had done was go from one failure to the next. Just as he was about to descend into another fit of despair, a voice spoke up. Excuse me, the voice said. Are you all right? Bell looked up. Standing in front of him was a short, beautiful woman with twin ponytails wearing a white dress and an apron. He sat up, wiping his eyes, and tried to sound positive. Yeah, I'm all right. He wasn't very convincing. The woman sat down next to him. Do you want to talk about it? She asked. Bell gave up and started crying. I'm sorry. It's just that I've been trying to join a familia for almost 2 weeks. But they won't even let me in the door. The woman put a hand on his shoulder. You want to be an adventurer? She asked softly. Ever since I was little, Bell said. My teacher even said he'd join the same familia as me if I found one, but I've been at it for 2 weeks and still nothing. Bell's head dropped as he tried to hold back a sob. Everything was quiet for a moment. Well, the woman said softly, what about mine? Bell's head jerked up as he stared at the woman. What? He asked, his breath catching in his throat. The woman put her head down. I'm sorry, she said, shyly. It's just that I've been in the lower world for 6 months and I haven't found anyone willing to join my familia. You'd be the only member, but you said you wanted to join one, so I thought. She trailed off into silence. Bell was astonished. Why? You're a goddess? He asked, hopefully. And you want me to join your familia? Well, yes, if you want to, the goddess said, smiling. Bell couldn't help himself. He hugged her. Thank you, he sobbed into her shoulder. Thank you. He felt her hug him back. They separated and the goddess stood up. Let me introduce myself properly, she said. My name is Hestia of the Olympian Pantheon. I am the goddess of hearth and home, and I would like you to join my familia. She reached out her hand towards him. Bell stood and shakily took her hand. My name is Bell Cranel, he said happily. And I would be thrilled to join your familia, Goddess Hestia. Hestia. Hestia was ecstatic as she let Bell drag her into an inn just off of the market square. She had finally found a mortal child who was willing to join her familia, one that was, in her own opinion, absolutely adorable. Hestia was one of the few gods who could truly see the color of a mortal soul. Her new child's soul was so pure, it shone like a beacon. Not only that, but he had a teacher, an experienced adventurer who was willing to join any familia that would accept Bell. Hestia could not have been more thrilled. 2 children, with one able to teach the other how not to get killed. What could be better? At least, that is what she thought until Bell threw open the door to his room and she got a good look at his teacher. She didn't even register what Bell was babbling about. She just stopped and stared. On the surface, he looked like an ordinary human. deep black hair that went to his shoulders with a close-cropped beard, both of which were starting to go gray, silver eyes that looked out of tan skin that was showing the barest hints of aging. Physically, he looked like a normal human adventurer. His aura, though, his soul, this man was beyond powerful, this man was beyond dangerous, this man was wrong. Torin. Earlier. Torin let out a small sigh as he flipped through one of the books he had bought from a store down the street. It was a ponderous read, all about the laws of Orario. Important but boring. He needed to know the laws of the city so that he could avoid breaking them, or, rather, so that he knew how best to avoid getting caught and what laws he should never even contemplate breaking. He leaned back in his chair. It might surprise anyone who knew his past that a former master assassin and master thief would be worried about the law, but back in Tamriel, there had been a few laws that even the Brotherhood and the Thieves' Guild would never dare break. It was the same here. He'd already come across a few laws that he would not dare break. Like the one he had just read about killing a god's mortal form. Apparently, the gods of this world took on physical, mortal forms when they descended into the mortal plane. While in the mortal world, they were forbidden from using their arcanum without permission from an assembly of gods. There were a few things they could do without permission, and he was sure there were a few things they could get away with without being detected, but overall it was pretty strict. As were the laws about killing their mortal form. Since the gods of this world couldn't use their powers, they weren't that hard to kill, but when they died, they were sent back to the heavens in a giant pillar of golden light. Not exactly stealthy. According to this book, no god had ever been killed without the culprit being caught with overwhelming evidence. And the punishment? Yikes. If a mortal killed a god, their punishment was for the other gods to essentially erase the mortal soul from existence one atom at a time. It sounded excruciating and apparently took days. Even gods weren't exempt from that law. If a god killed another god, their punishment was losing all their money, losing their familia, and being sent back to heaven permanently. Torin looked up from his book to stare at the door. Bell was later getting back than usual. On most days, by this time, he'd have dragged himself inside and flopped down on his bed. Torin would spend the next hour or so consoling him before they had dinner and went to bed. Bell's resolve the last 2 weeks had been impressive, but he could see it starting to crack. He'd been unfortunately right about the familias of Orario judging potential new members on appearance instead of potential. Bell still hadn't been able to even meet with a god. He kept getting turned away by the guards. Torin sighed again. He'd wait another week, and if Bell still hadn't found a familia, then Torin would go with him to one of the larger familias. Probably Loki. If they judged by appearance, he knew they wouldn't reject him. He'd just insist they let the kid in too. He could be persuasive when he wanted to be. Torin was torn from his thoughts by the sound of pounding feet on the stairs, followed by the door being blown open by a frantic Bell, who appeared to be dragging a girl behind him. "Mr. Torin," Bell exclaimed happily. "I did it. I found a familia to join." Torin smiled as he stood. "Well done, Bell. Though, maybe you should introduce your friend first." Torin looked at the woman in the white dress. No, he realized suddenly. This was no woman. She was a goddess, and she was staring at him with a mix of wonder and horror. That was interesting. Oblivious to the thoughts of both Torin and the goddess, Bell continued on. "Right, sorry." He gestured to the goddess. "This is Goddess Hestia. She hasn't been in the lower word long and is looking to start a familia and asked if I'd like to be the first member. I told her about you and brought her here to meet you." Well now, Torin thought. Starting a brand new familia? If nothing else, it'll be interesting. Though I am concerned about the way she is looking at me. Just what is she seeing? Torin smiled. "Congratulations, Bell. I'm glad you found someone." He turned to the goddess. "My name is Torin. I'd introduce myself properly, but it seems like you have questions." She stared at him for a moment before saying, "Your soul. It shouldn't exist. A soul like yours does not belong in this plane. What are you?" Bell's head swiveled as he looked between them, confused. "Ah," Torin said. He'd been afraid something like this might happen. "That requires an explanation that should not be overheard. Do you know somewhere quiet we could go to have that conversation?" Hestia nodded. "My home. It's an abandoned church. It may not look like much, but it is quiet." "Lead the way," Torin said seriously. "This is a talk that should be had in private." Hestia. At Hestia's church. Hestia led Bell and Torin into the basement of her church. They'd both been quiet during the walk over. The more she looked at Torin, the more familiar he felt. She looked past the simple fact that his soul did not belong. Why did it not belong? Despite its wrongness, why did it feel so familiar? "I'll have my answers soon enough," she thought as she sat down on her bed. Bell and Torin sat down on the couch. Torin seemed to think for a second before saying, "Is there any specific question you would like to ask? Somewhere I should start." Hestia paused, before saying, "I can feel divine energy flowing through you. It's not a Falna. It's literally part of you. Your soul seems to be closer to that of a spirit than a mortal. Almost as though you were created by a god directly. The energy is familiar, but I can't place it. Whose energy is that? Which god created you? Torin smiled. You are not wrong to say that I was created by a god. Although I was unaware of it for years, I did not have mortal parents. Just like my winged brothers, all that I am, my soul and my physical form, was created directly by a god. We call him Bormahu, father. Most mortals, though, refer to him as Akatosh. At his bidding, I saved my world from countless horrors. Coming here is supposed to be my retirement. Hestia's eyes were so wide they could be mistaken for dinner plates. Akatosh, that's why it felt so familiar. She hadn't felt Akatosh's energy in millennia. Not since he and the others began the creation of Mundus. She and the other gods had modeled their own world after the one Akatosh and Lorcan had created. Unlike them, however, she and her compatriots had been extremely careful not to allow their divine essence to become bound to their creation. That was why he felt so wrong. When she and the other gods had began to create mortal souls, they had never created one like his. He was Dragonborn. Her friend, Meridia, had mentioned them the last time she visited Tenkai, before Hestia descended. He literally had a dragon's soul. Hestia sighed. That explains a great deal. You are Dragonborn, right? He nodded. This would take some explaining. Akatosh and the others are bound to Mundus. Their essences literally cannot leave. Neither can their direct creations because they are, technically, still a part of them. Akatosh created the dragons of your world. They are similar to the great spirits of our world, only far more powerful. Torin was listening intently as she leaned back. The reason you seem to be so wrong is that in this world, dragons do not have souls and are far less powerful. They are monsters, barely more intelligent than most animals and purely driven by instinct. In this world, dragon souls don't exist. They were not created by any gods, and they have not evolved naturally. They literally break the rules we set when we made this world. The man leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Bormahu said that if I did not join a familia within a year, that my powers would begin to fade. Is this what he meant? Hestia nodded. Yes. Without the divine laws of this world accepting you as you are, your essence would begin to change to fit within the rules of this world. While you would likely not become any weaker physically or magically, you would begin to change. Any powers that are a part of your soul would eventually vanish or change as your soul adapted to this world. He stared at her intensely. Is there any way to fix it? Without the use of a Falna? I am Dovahkian. It is who I am, and I do not wish to change. I am not averse to joining a familia if it means keeping my powers, but I need to know my options. Hestia thought for a moment. It is possible to add to the rules of this world through the use of Arcanum, however, that would require permission, and it is far easier to do it through a Falna, especially if I do it. Why you specifically? Hestia smiled. Like the gods of your world, we each have our own spheres that we govern. I am the goddess of hearth and home. Home is where all are accepted. Giving you a Falna means accepting you into my home, my world. By doing so, even should you somehow lose your Falna, the world has already accepted your soul and your connection to Akatosh. Few, if any, of my brethren will even notice your acceptance if I am the one who does this. Your soul will never be at risk again. Hestia observed Torin as he sat back. He seemed to be deep in thought. After a minute, he leaned forward. I have a few more questions, he said. Bell mentioned a monster, a large black dragon with one eye. From the descriptions, it sounds like it is nearly as powerful as the Dova of my world. If it does not have a soul, how is it so powerful? That stumped Hestia for a second. She had never personally encountered or observed the black dragon. The black dragon is an enigma, she said, looking down at her hands, even to the gods. The dungeon is not an open book. Only Uranus, our chief, knows what lies at the bottom. That was by design. In the beginning, we craved entertainment above all else. What is more entertaining than something that is a mystery even to the gods themselves? What is more enticing than the thrill of discovery? All we truly know is that if we do not send adventurers into the dungeon itself will attack the surface. She looked up again and crossed her legs. The three great beasts escaped the dungeon before most of us had even descended. We don't know why they were so powerful. We know that the dragon is the strongest by far, but not why. However, most of us don't think they were meant to be more than a distraction. Extremely dangerous, yes, but not a true threat to the existence of our world. The doom of our world, as Akatosh would say, is whatever unleashed the great beasts, and that lies at the bottom of the dungeon. Torin sat back to consider what Hestia had said. Glancing at Bell, he could see that the boy was a little nervous but seemed to be following along all right. He was sure that this was a lot of information to dump on him at once. After a moment, he asked his next question. If we do this, he said, If you accept me into your home and stabilize my soul, will there be any repercussions? Any side effects that we don't know about? He did not want to cause problems for this world, just because he didn't want to change. Hestia considered the question. Finally, she answered, "No, I do not believe there will be any problems. You are and would still be the only dragon soul that exists in this world. It will reopen your connection with Akatosh, but he is unable to leave his realm. He couldn't come here even if he wanted to. As for the dragons in the dungeon, even if by some miracle they developed a soul, it would not be the same. They have no connection to Akatosh. You would still be unique, but there would be no serious issues to come from this." That was a relief. He did not want to be the cause of any problems. He considered the one-eyed black dragon again. From what Hestia had said, it had come from the dungeon and there was no record of it speaking or using any powers that resembled the Thu'um. Perhaps his fears were unfounded. And the black dragon was not a reborn Alduin? He certainly hoped so. Decision made, he asked his last question. "Are you willing to do this? To accept my existence by the rules of this world?" Hestia stared at him for a moment before smiling. "Yes," she said. "From what I know of Dragonborn, your life has been one trial after another. Further, there is not a single god of this world who thinks badly of Akatosh. You deserve to rest. I will gladly accept you into my home, my world, and my familia." Tauren smiled, tiredly. "Thank you, Goddess Hestia," he said before turning to Bell. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything about this to you, Bell. But I needed to speak to a god before I was comfortable with talking about it. Do you have any questions?" Bell stared for a moment. "I think I followed what you were talking about pretty well. You were a hero in your world and came here to retire." He seemed excited by that. "But you aren't totally human, and your type of soul doesn't exist here, so you need Hestia to help make sure your soul doesn't change? Do I have that right?" Tauren chuckled. "Yeah, that's the gist of it. Do you have any problems with that?" Bell suddenly seemed full of energy. "Are you kidding? I get to learn from a real-life hero? That's amazing." "Thank you, Bell," Tauren said gratefully. "Well now," he nodded to Hestia. "Should we get this done?" Bell's waited a long time to get a Falna, so I think he should go first. Hestia stood up. "I agree," she said, and moved to the side before suddenly blushing. "I'm sorry, Bell, but I need you to take your shirt off and lay down. I need access to your back to give you a Falna." Bell's face turned the color of a ripe tomato, but he nodded and pulled off his shirt and jacket. He quickly laid down on the bed and hid his face in the pillow. After a moment, Tauren heard a muffled, "I'm ready, Goddess Hestia." Still a bit red, Hestia straddled Bell's back. Taking a needle and chanting softly, she pricked one of her fingers and let the blood drop onto Bell's back. It was fascinating to watch as strange symbols and numbers started to float over Bell's back. Hestia seemed to manipulate them for a moment before pushing them down into Bell's back. Bell's body now sported what looked like a tattoo of a brazier with words and symbols inked around it. Hestia took a piece of paper and copied the information onto the sheet. "And that's it," she said, moving to get off of Bell. Tauren was curious, though. Is there no way to hide his status? Or can it only be read by a divine? Hestia seemed startled, then suddenly flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I totally forgot I could lock his status." Grabbing her needle again, placed another drop of blood on Bell's back, and his status slowly disappeared. Moving off of Bell, she looked at the sheet again. "You've been training, Bell, right?" she asked Tauren. "That's right," he said as Bell sat up eagerly. "For about 2 months now." "Then I guess it makes sense," she said, handing the sheet to Bell. "It's rare for an adventurer to start with stats above 0 but not unheard of. They are a bit higher than usual, though." Bell stared at the sheet with wonder, his hands trembling. "I did it," he whispered. "I have a Falna. I'm finally an adventurer." "That you are," Bell, Hestia said with a huge smile. "Congratulations." "Congratulations indeed," Kid Tauren said as he moved to Bell's side. Looking down at the sheet, he read Bell's status over his shoulder. Bell Cranel. Race human. Level 1. Strength, I-77. Vit, I-13. Dex, I-93. AGI, H-148. Mag, I-0. Total equals 331. Skills, none. Magic, none. Tauren clapped Bell on the shoulder. "Well done, kid," he said happily. "Those look pretty good for a beginner. Now we just have to do yours, Tauren, and we can go register you at the guild," Hestia said. Nodding, Tauren removed his tunic and laid face first on the bed. He could feel Hestia sitting on top of him. "This may feel a bit strange, but it shouldn't hurt," she said. He felt a drop hit his back, and something in his soul shifted. Unaware of the world around him, Tauren was suddenly focused inward. His connection to Akatosh had come rushing back in like a flood the second Hestia's blood had hit his skin. He hadn't realized how muted it had become in just 2 short months. It felt like that first breath of fresh air after nearly drowning in the sea. He basked in the feeling for a moment before refocusing on the world around him. Hestia was still sitting on his back, and he could now feel a connection to her in his mind. She slowly slid off his back, staring at his sheet looking gobsmacked. "Is there something wrong?" he asked. Hestia looked up, startled. "No, no," she exclaimed. "Everything went perfectly. It's just that your stats are insane. There's never been an adventurer this strong before." He took the sheet from her and, gazing down at it, asked, "I don't suppose there's any way we can hide this, is there? It's bound to cause a lot of trouble." Hestia went to answer before pausing, her hand on her chin. Finally, she answered, "I have no idea. That's something we should talk to the guild about." Glancing out the small window at the setting sun, Torin said, "That'll probably have to wait for tomorrow then." He looked back down at his sheet and let out a low whistle. He had to admit he was impressed with himself. Torin. Race? Nord Dragonborn. Level 10. Strength, S999. Vit, S999. Dex, S995. AGI S993. Mag, S992. Total equals 4,987. Racial abilities. Dragon Soul. The bearer has the soul of a dragon. With each true dragon killed, the bearer absorbs the slain dragon's soul and steals their power. Allows the use of dragon shouts. Error. Dragons are non-sentient monsters. Non-sentient monsters do not have true souls in Genkai. Error resolved. True dragon souls allowed existence by Goddess Hestia. May have unintended consequences. Skill will work as stated. Dragon Blood. The bearer has the blood of a dragon. Resist fire, 25%. Resist frost, 25%. Resist magic, 20%. Note: magic resistance does not apply to dragon shouts. Resist frost. Grants 50% resistance to cold, frost spells, and frost abilities. Stacks with dragon blood effect. Frost resistance is 75%. Battle Cry. Causes all targets 3 or more levels below the caster to flee. Less effective against sentient enemies. Can be resisted by willpower if the target is strong enough. Skills. Master Assassin, you are the knight. Silent and unseen. The bearer cannot be seen, heard, or smelled unless they choose to be. Master Thief. Locks and attentive guards do not bother you. The riches of the world are yours for the taking. Master Warrior. You are a human weapon. You cannot feel the weight of your armor. Your weapons are a part of your body. Archmage. The universe is your plaything. Your mind is safe from illusion and control. The minds of your enemies are an open book. Destruction is your friend. Death is reversible. The physical world is altered at your whims. The summoned creatures of the world are at your beck and call. Master Alchemist. Be it poison or medicine, you are the master of its creation. Master Blacksmith. The elements of the world are putty in your hands. Master Enchanter. The magic of the world bends to your desires. Experienced Teacher. All those you consider to be your students receive an increase to experience gain. Magic. Tamrielic Magic. Schools. Destruction 100. Restoration 100. Alteration 100. Illusion 100. Conjuration 100. Dragon Shouts. Within Babel. Uranus opened his eyes slowly. Something new has been added. His voice was somber. The black-robed figure standing beside his throne looked up. Will it affect our plans? The eerie voice asked. No, Uranus said, turning his attention back to the Dungoan. For now, it is unimportant. Unknown regions. The creature stirred. As I opened, slowly, something was different. Something had changed. Could not smell anything nearby. What had? Like the rush of a wave, the information flooded back in. Bormahu. Hazel. His kingdom. The traitor. Human pests. The Kel. Drifting. Return. Resurrections. Dovakian. Pain. The traitor's lifeblood on his teeth. Retreat. Feasting. Dovakian. His eye. Nothingness. A strange place. His mind slipping. Escape. Rage. The world was suddenly spinning faster and faster. NIID. Reality snapped back into place. He remembered himself again. He was Alduin, Mulag in Zaklot. He did not know how, but his mind had returned. He could feel Bormahu again. He sniffed the air and growled, deeply. He did not know where he was, but it would be his. Or he would burn it to ashes and feast on its bones. Chapter 5. Torin. Torin stood in the empty church as the sun's first light peeked through one of the holes in the collapsed roof. He had been up for well over an hour, contemplating a few things. Firstly was whether or not he should register as an adventurer. He was interested in at least seeing what was in the dungeon, and he wasn't confident about sending Bell into it alone, especially not on his first day. On the other hand, if registering meant releasing information about his status, that would cause a serious problem. For the past 7 years, the strongest adventurer in Ororio had been King Otter of the Freya Familia. He could just imagine the uproar when, out of nowhere, a familia with no known resources, no history, and only 2 members, suddenly had an adventurer 3 levels higher than the best in the city. One nobody had ever even heard of. The chaos would be legendary, and neither Hestia nor Bell would be able to handle that. Not yet, at least. He would know more today, after they had spoken with the guild officials. If he had to wait to register, that would be fine. There was plenty that he could do on the surface to help prepare his new familia for the fallout his existence would cause. The biggest being the state of their lodgings. This church, or rather the basement, was Hestia's home, and that meant it was her familia's home. That wouldn't do. The state of the dilapidated building was pitiful. He'd wandered around the property already, trying to figure out if it could be saved. The lot had been given to Hestia by the goddess Hephaestus as both a gift and a means to stop Hestia from mooching off her. In terms of location, the church was actually in a pretty good spot. The lot the church stood on was far larger than the church itself, which made for easy expansion. The lots surrounding it were either empty or had abandoned buildings, which meant they could be bought at lower prices to expand even further. It was also fairly close to everything a familia needed access to. The abandoned area was surrounded by on all sides by important areas. The guild building, the market square, the dungeon, even the storehouses were nearby. As for the church itself, it was in pretty rough shape. There were more holes in the roof than there was actual roofing, and 2 of the walls looked like they were about to collapse. The only reason they hadn't was that there was no roof left for them to support. Still, the basement was secure and the foundation was strong. He had money. More than he knew what to do with, if he was being honest. He could practically hear Delvin and Vex salivating at the thought of that much gold. It made no sense to him to keep his money to himself when he could use it to better his own, and by extension Bell and Hestia's, living conditions. He could even do the renovation himself, though that may take quite some time. Better to hire someone to do it. He'd read that the Goibniu Familia sometimes did building projects. Maybe he'd hire them. There was a space to the back of the property that looked perfect for a forge, and he had the materials to make alchemy and enchanting tables. Monster crystals seemed to work like soul gems, but he'd have to do some experimenting to see if they'd work to make proper enchantments. He was torn from his thoughts by the creak of the basement door opening behind him. Out came a practically giddy Bell, dragging a slightly groggy-looking Hestia by the wrist. Torin chuckled. "I take it you're ready to get started, then?" he asked, amusedly. "Yes, sir," Bell said happily. Hestia still seemed to be waking up. Torin smiled. "Let's get going then," he said. "We'll grab some food on the way to the guild building." Torin eyed the adventurers around him as they walked into the guild building. There weren't many out at this time, but a decent number of early risers were already meeting with advisors and prepping for their daily trip into the Dungoan. There didn't appear to be any signs specifically for registration, just a bunch of counters with guild officials standing behind them. Moving to one of the open counters, he observed the official. She had elven ears, but they were considerably smaller than those of a normal elf in this world. A half-elf, with brown hair, green eyes, and glasses, she seemed a bit young, especially for a half-elf. Stepping up to the counter, he addressed her. "Excuse me," he said. "We were hoping to talk to someone about registering a new familia." "Certainly," the woman smiled. "It doesn't require much, just a few forms. We also had a few questions for the guild that are best done in private." Torin said seriously, "Are there any private areas where we can talk?" "Oh," the woman seemed startled. "Of course. The guild has several rooms for dealing with sensitive business. Please follow me." She led them into a back room and, after closing the door, she sat down on one of the couches. "Allow me to introduce myself," she said. "My name is Ina Tool, and I am one of the guild's advisors." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Torin said as he sat down opposite her. Bell and Hestia sat beside him. "My name is Torin. This is Bell and this is Hestia, the goddess of our familia. It's nice to meet you." "So," she said, pulling out a rather hefty stack of forms. "These are the forms you need to register a familia, as well as new adventurers. You said you had private business to discuss, though. Would you like to handle that first?" "That would probably be best," Torin said. "You see, Bell and I are new to Ororio. I am rather experienced as an adventurer and have been teaching Bell for a few months now, but there are some issues with my status, specifically my level, which would cause problems for the familia if they were made public. Especially for a familia as small as ours. I know that certain information about adventurers is made public by registering. Is there any way for me to enter the dungeon and continue teaching Bell, but not release my information to the public? Aina considered that for a moment. Lying about your level is highly illegal and usually results in severe sanctions against a familia. She said, "Can I ask what exactly you don't want known? I give my word not to tell anyone, even my colleagues." Torin had expected that and had asked Hestia to make a copy of his status that didn't show his skills or magic. Handing over the sheet, he watched as first, Aina's eyebrows disappeared into her bangs, before her face suddenly went very pale. Is this accurate?" she asked, shakily. "I am willing to let you examine my Falna to confirm it, so long as you do not attempt to look at my skills," Torin said. Yes. I'm sorry, but I must confirm this." Aina seemed a bit overwhelmed. Torin pulled his tunic up over his head and turned his back to Aina. He'd asked Hestia to leave his status unlocked, just in case they needed to do this. After a moment, Aina spoke up again. In a quiet voice she said, "You can put your shirt down. I can certainly understand why you would want to hide that." She looked like she might faint. "Is there any way for me to register but keep this hidden, without breaking the law?" he asked as he put his shirt down and turned to face her again. The question seemed to break Aina out of her stupor. The level of all active adventurers is publicly announced at registration, along with each subsequent level up, but, she paused. The information on retired and semi-retired adventurers is removed from the notice boards and kept in a file here in the guild. If you register as semi-retired, then you could still enter the dungeon with restrictions, but your information would be placed in a file at the guild, rather than on the notice boards. The file is a public document, so the information would still be available, but only if someone went looking for it. Torin sighed in relief. That sounded perfect. If nothing else, it would give them some time before someone discovered the document. If I register as semi-retired, what restrictions would I be under? Semi-retired adventurers often function as teachers for newer members of their familia. Like you're doing with him, she gestured at Bell. The restrictions aren't too bad either. Semi-retired adventurers are allowed to enter the dungeon, but only until the safe zone on the 18th floor. They are also forbidden from participating in guild-issued quests, familia expeditions, or wargames. If you participate in any of those, level up, or so much as set foot on the 19th floor, you will be automatically moved to active status, and your information will be placed on the notice boards. The restrictions seemed rather harsh, but they also made a great deal of sense. As a new familia with only one active member, they were unlikely to be issued a quest or challenge to a wargame, and expeditions were out of the question until they had more members. Torin was a bit bummed about being restricted to the first 18 floors though. They were for level 1 to 2 parties. He was level 10. While perfect for training Bell, if he went into the dungeon alone, they would be utterly boring. Still, this deal seemed like the perfect way to accomplish their goals. "All right then," he said. "I'll register as semi-retired, while Bell will be active." "Perfect," Aina said. "First we need to register your familia. Then we can do your personal registrations." "I believe that's where I come in," Hestia spoke up. "Yes, Goddess Hestia," Aina said. "First I need you to." What followed was several hours of tedious bureaucratic paperwork, by the end of which, both Hestia and Bell's eyes were spinning and Torin's hand was cramping. He hadn't done that much paperwork in decades. Hell, he had barely done any even while serving as an Imperial advisor. Since Bell already had a decent weapon for a level 1, he only needed to pay for the guild-issued starting armor. Aina went ahead and registered herself as his advisor. Also, since Bell was their familia's only active adventurer, he was registered as the captain. Before they could leave though, Torin had one final question. "Would it be possible for us to buy or, at least access a copy of all the information the guild has on the dungeon?" The fact that Aina's eyes seemed to shine when he asked that question should have been a warning of what was to come. What followed was a long explanation of how the guild did not sell copies of the information, but it was fully accessible in the guild library. Few adventurers ever accessed it though because, in Aina's words, they were a bunch of idiots with a death wish. She clearly had a problem with adventurers being reckless. He should probably try harder to keep Bell from being an idiot. As the teacher, she would likely be madder at him than Bell if the kid did something stupid. Still, with that information in hand, Torin sat down with Aina and Bell and spent the rest of the day, and all of the next, going over every scrap of information the guild had on the first 10 floors of the Dungoan. Aina had extracted a promise from them that they, especially Bell, would not set foot on a new floor without first doing thorough research on what they would find there. Meanwhile, after an extended conversation with Hestia about funding, he'd given her a decent amount of money and sent her to the Goibniu Familia home to see about hiring an architect and some builders. The three of them had spent their third and fourth days after registering going over the plans with the architect. They ended up buying all the lots around them in preparation for expansion. They all wanted the Familia to grow to a pretty decent size, maybe even rivaling Freya and Loki someday, so they had made the plans with future expansion in mind. For now, they would turn what was the old church into an entrance hall, with a dining hall, a large kitchen, living areas, a library, and a central open courtyard all branching off of it. The living quarters were to be on the second floor, and they had decided that 20 bedrooms was a more than ambitious enough start for them. Thorin had also ordered a private building on the back of the property to house the forge he had ordered along with his enchanting and alchemy laboratories. Finally, on the 5th day after their trip to the guild, they received word from Aina that their registrations had gone though. They had clearance to enter the dungeon. Babble. Dungeon entrance. Bell. Bell could barely contain his excitement as he watched the stairs down into the dungeon. Finally, he was actually going to enter the dungeon. He was wearing the chest plate that the guild had given him and had his dagger strapped to his side. Looking to his right, he saw Mr. Thorin standing there in what he called his travel armor. Apparently, he didn't think that the first floor warranted the use of his real armor. Considering his level, that made sense. "All right, kid," Mr. Thorin said. "Remember what we talked about. We are sticking to the first floor today so you can get used to fighting in the dungeon. The only things we are supposed to encounter are lone goblins. They don't spawn in groups and are the only hostile monster that spawns on this floor. You'll be doing all the fighting yourself. I won't step in unless it looks like you're going to get yourself killed. You got that?" "Yes, Mr. Thorin," Bell nodded. They'd spent hours going over information and plans that he'd done his best to memorize. "All right then, let's go." The two descended the stairs and into the dungeon. The information that Ms. Aina had given them said that the first floor looked like an underground cave with bluish walls, and that description certainly fit. The wide hall that the info said was called the beginning road stretched out before them when they reached the bottom of the stairs. "Head on a swivel, Bell," Mr. Thorin said. Trying to calm his nerves, Bell nodded and drew his dagger. He could still hear one of the first lessons Mr. Thorin had given him. "Never sheath your weapon in a dangerous environment. Bell, if you think you might be ambushed, you either keep your weapon handy or have magic ready to cast. Drawing your weapon wastes precious time, so keep it ready." Bell didn't know any magic yet, so he kept his dagger drawn and listened for the crack that signaled a monster spawning. It wasn't until the corridor had started to thin out that he heard it. There was a soft crackling noise before. With a mighty crack, a goblin burst out of the floor. Bell, used to monster encounters on the road, wasted no time. He burst forward, intending to skewer the goblin before it had a chance to react. He thrust with his dagger and missed. The goblin had jumped out of the way. Bell overextended in his surprise and felt the goblin's claws rake across his shoulder before he could dodge. He hissed at the stinging sensation as he rolled away from the goblin. Standing, he eyed it warily as he rolled his shoulder. It didn't seem to have done much damage physically, but he did feel embarrassed and angry. That had been a stupid mistake. Monsters in the Dungoan were faster and stronger than the ones on the surface. He knew that, but like an idiot, he had forgotten it. The goblin leapt at him this time, but, determined not to embarrass himself again, he was ready for it. He caught the goblin's outstretched wrist and plunged his dagger into its neck. The goblin exploded into a shower of dust and a crystal dropped to the floor. Picking up the crystal, he glanced hesitantly up at his teacher. Mr. Thorin was standing in exactly the same place. His arms crossed, he stared at Bell and raised an eyebrow. "Do I even need to say it?" he asked. Bell flushed with embarrassment. "No, sir. I got overconfident." Mr. Thorin stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Being overconfident is a hallmark of the young, and making mistakes is how we learn. Never making the same mistake twice means we learned the lesson. Don't do that again. Be grateful it wasn't a more painful mistake, and I'll consider it a lesson well learned." Mr. Thorin really was the best. Bell nodded and said, "I promise. I won't rush in like an idiot, and I won't get overconfident and take on more than I can handle unless I have no choice." "Good man," Mr. Thorin said, patting his shoulder. "A last stand is a last resort. Never take on overwhelming odds unless you have no choice. Remember that." Bell nodded. "Let's continue on," Mr. Thorin said as they moved further down the passage. After that first incident, Bell had been determined not to make any silly mistakes. Sure, he'd had to block or dodge attacks he hadn't seen coming. His chest plate had even caught a couple attacks he just hadn't been able to avoid, but none of them happened because he had rushed in like an idiot again. Mr. Thorin had critiqued Bell's performance after each fight and seemed to be happy with how he was doing. Despite saying that he would let Bell manage all the fighting, Mr. Thorin did kill one goblin. It had burst out of the ground right at Mr. Thorin's feet and he had stomped on it out of reflex. The goblin had burst into dust before it could completely pull itself out of the floor, leaving nothing but a crystal and a boot print in the dust. Bell couldn't help himself and started laughing when that happened. They had been in the dungeon for maybe an hour when Bell got his first drop item. He had been dealing with a particularly vicious goblin and had only managed to beat it by grabbing a handful of dust off the dungeon floor and throwing it into the goblin's eye. When the goblin screeched and clutched its eye, Bell drove his dagger into its chest. To his astonishment, one of the goblin's ears had dropped along with the crystal. Altogether, they spent nearly 6 hours in the dungeon that day fighting every monster they could find on the first floor. Bell had never felt more exhausted or more satisfied than he did as they climbed the steps out of the dungeon and headed for the guild. As they entered the building, Ms. Ina came rushing up to them. "How did it go?" she asked as she stopped in front of them. "It went well," Mr. Torren said. "Aside from a single mistake at the start, Bell did an excellent job today." Bell beamed at him and Ms. Ina seemed happy. "Are you here to turn in your magic stones?" she asked him. "Yes, Ms. Ina," Bell said happily. "I even got a drop item." "A drop item on your first day? You got pretty lucky with that. They don't drop often on the first floor," she said as she led them to the turn-in counter. Bell placed the magic stones and the goblin ear in the tray and waited as the man behind the counter looked over everything. 17 goblin stones and 1 goblin ear comes out at 6,000 valis, he said, pushing the tray back with Bell's money in it. "Not bad for your first day, kid. Well done." Bell grinned as he scooped up his money. He couldn't wait to tell Goddess Hestia about how today went. 2 weeks later, Bell was riding high as he ran through the 5th floor. He'd been delving into the first 5 floors of the dungeon for 2 weeks now, but today was different. This morning, Mr. Torren had said that, so long as he stuck to the first 5 floors, he was ready to go into the dungeon solo. He was so excited, and he was doing well. He'd collected nearly 30 goblin, dungeon lizard, and kobold stones already and still felt full of energy. He just killed another goblin when a loud roar echoed through the tunnel followed by terrified screams. Bell stood, nervously. He could practically hear Mr. Torren's voice. A loud roar echoing through a dungeon followed by screams, maybe a classic of hero tales. But it means only one thing in real life. Something really bad is coming. I know you want to be a hero, Bell, but you're nowhere near ready for that. Promise me, Bell, that if something like that happens, you won't go rushing in. Promise me that if that happens, you will turn around and run for your life. I promise, Mr. Torren, Bell had said. He stood, indecisive for a moment, but he knew what he needed to do. He turned back down the corridor and sprinted as fast as he could, looking for the stairs back to the surface. He was only a few turns from the surface when he skidded to a halt. There, standing in the corridor in front of him, was a hulking figure. With its cloven hooves and massive horns, there could be no mistake. It was a minotaur. What the hell was it doing on the upper floors? Bell didn't even have time to think as the minotaur let out a bellow and charged. Bell turned and fled as fast as his feet would carry him. Wag, he screamed as he ran. He'd honestly thought Mr. Torren's lessons on how to run for your life had been a little silly, but now, he was never more grateful for anything in his life. Unfortunately, in his panic, he made a wrong turn and skidded to a halt in a dead end. He turned, hoping against hope that he could get back out of the corridor. No suck luck. There, in the entrance to the hall, stood the minotaur. "A last stand is a last resort, Bell," Mr. Torren had said. Well, Mr. Torren, Bell thought, I think I'd call this a last resort kind of moment. He drew his knife and waited for the charge. Ace bolted down the corridor, following the sound of the roars and screaming. She and Bet had managed to take down all but one of the minotaurs that had fled from them on the 17th floor. She stopped at the sound of a battle cry followed by a minotaur's roar before rushing down another corridor. There, she could see the minotaur. Someone was fighting it. A white-haired boy around her age. His armor and the way he was moving screamed level 1, but for a level 1 he was impressively fast. Although unable to get past the minotaur and out into the corridor, he was agile enough to not only avoid the minotaur's attacks but actually score shallow cuts on it with his knife. Before she could act to save him, he did something that, when she had time to think later, she would be impressed by. The minotaur had swung one of its massive hands trying to brain the level 1, but he, in a feat that was as brave as it was stupid, rammed his knife into the swinging arm and let the momentum carry him off the ground. Then the boy's own weight carried him back down and the knife, embedded in the monster's wrist, carved a trench that severed the minotaur's hand, which fell to the ground. The minotaur let out a bellow of pain and lashed out with its remaining hand, catching the boy in the chest and sending him careening into the Dungoan wall. His armor shattered. The minotaur pounced, but Ace was there first. Her sword carved the minotaur in half from shoulder to hip, spraying the boy with blood. As the minotaur burst into dust, she and the boy stared at each other. He could not be more than 2 years younger than her, with white hair and red eyes. The smallest, most childish part of the back of her mind couldn't help but thinking it. He looked like a bunny rabbit. Are you all right? She asked, extending a hand to help him up. He didn't take it. Instead, he just sat there, staring at her. As the panic in his eyes faded, he suddenly flushed and, with a wordless scream, darted past her and down the hall, sprinting for the stairs. Bet, who had entered the hall as the boy started to run, howled with laughter. Again, that small, childish part of her mind spoke up. The bunny boy had run away. Ace almost felt like pouting. At the very least, she would have to find and apologize to him, since this was technically the fault of her familia. First, though, she would need to shut Bet up. His laugh was so irritating. Chapter 6. Ina sighed as she stepped out of the guild building for a breath of fresh air. It got so stuffy in there sometimes, and today was even worse. She'd been worried and nervous all day because today was Bell's first attempt at tackling the dungeon solo. She'd been reluctant to agree to him facing the first 5 floors alone, but had been convinced by Bell's teacher, Mr. Thu'um. The first level 10 in history. The one whose very existence didn't make sense and whose status she'd helped hide from the public. She hadn't done anything illegal or wrong, of course, but it was still nerve-wracking. Still, she supposed he was a very nice man. Serious, but a very good teacher. He'd been so adamant that, provided nothing abnormal happened, Bell could handle the first 5 floors alone. Bell had looked so hopeful when he'd said that, and his stats certainly supported it, so she'd given her permission. Bell had very quickly become her favorite adventurer. Not just because of how absolutely adorable he was, but because he took everything she told him so seriously. He was the only adventurer she knew who didn't ignore their advisor. If Ina said Bell wasn't ready for something, he didn't do it. He did his research properly and, aside from a single stupid mistake he'd made on his first day, he never did anything reckless. She knew she had Mr. Thu'um to thank for Bell's diligent, cautious attitude, but that didn't make her any less fond of him. It just made her appreciate Mr. Thu'um's input more. He really was a very good teacher. "Ms. Ina," she heard from behind her. That was Bell's voice. Ina turned quickly, glad to hear his voice. "Bell, I'm glad you made it back okay, Aya." He was covered in blood. Ina rushed towards him. "What happened to you?" she exclaimed. "I got attacked by a minotaur and saved by this beautiful blonde lady," he said happily. Ina thought she was going to faint. After dragging Bell inside and forcing him into one of the showers in the back of the guild office, she finally got the full story out of him. When he tried to apologize about his ruined armor, she had waved it aside. It had done its job and saved him, so she promised to take him shopping for new armor after Monsterphilia. When he had finished the story, she let out a great sigh. She was relieved that he hadn't deliberately gone looking for trouble, but it was still a terrifying story. A minotaur on level 5? They were all lucky nobody had been killed. Bell almost had been. "Do you know who the blonde lady who saved me was?" His eyes shining hopefully. "It sounds like Ace Wallenstein of the Loki Familia." "Ace Wallenstein," Bell said with wonder. "What's she like?" "Well, she is a level 5 executive of the Loki Familia. In fact, after the triumvirate that leads them, she is their highest-ranking member. She is also the best or perhaps second-best sword in Orario. Maybe third now with your teacher around. She has been given the moniker Sword Princess by the gods." "I don't mean that," Bell said. "I mean, what does she like to eat? What are her hobbies? Things like that." He had a crush on his savior. "I'm sorry, Bell, but I don't know. Plus," she was conflicted. "I'm sorry, but a relationship between you two is very unlikely. She's on the verge of level 6 and has years under her belt while you're level 1 and have barely even started. Not only that, but dating and marriage between familia is very difficult at the best of times. Even if your familia are of equal standing, if your gods don't get along, they can forbid you from dating." The poor boy looked crushed. Then again, she really shouldn't do this. If you somehow manage to catch up to her in levels and increase the size and standing of your familia, it may be possible. She'd done it anyway. Bell was looking at her as though he was dying of thirst, and she'd given him a bottle of water. He stood suddenly. "Thank you, Ms. Ina," he shouted, bolting out of the building. "You're the best," he called back to her as he ran. "Oh dear," she muttered to herself. "I hope no trouble comes of that." Bell was running through the streets with a new determination. Ace Wallenstein, he would catch up to her. He would build up his familia. He would get far stronger. Strong enough to stand at her side. Strong enough to repay her for saving his life. He was so caught up in his thoughts that he hadn't paid attention to where he was going. He was dragged back to reality when he slammed into another person, knocking something out of their hands and onto the ground. "Ouch," the person said, trying to catch their balance. "I'm so sorry," Bell said, bowing up and down as fast as he could. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," the person, now revealed to be a silver-haired girl, said. She was wearing a green uniform of some kind, with an apron. "I'm a bit upset about my ruined dinner though," she said, looking at the box he'd accidentally knocked to the ground, its contents strewn all over the road. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," Bell repeated, bowing up and down as fast as he could once again. Is there any way I can make it up to you? The girl had a sudden mischievous glint in her eye. Well, she said, I suppose you can make it up to B by having dinner here tomorrow night. Huh. Belle was confused. The girl pointed at the building behind her. Looking up, Belle realized it was a tavern. This is the hostess of fertility, the girl said. I work here. We're slammed full tonight, but you can pay me back by coming here to have dinner tomorrow night. Belle, thrilled to be able to make up for his clumsiness, accepted. I'll come. I promise. He paused. Can I bring a member of my familia? There are only 2 of us and my goddess is having dinner with some other gods tomorrow night. Sure, the girl said. The more the merrier. I'm Seer, by the way. Seer Flova. Bell Cranel, he replied happily. Torin. Torin sat on the couch in the church basement, watching as Hestia updated Belle's status. He had to admit this was not how he expected the day would end. Belle had been doing fantastically in the dungeon, so he thought the kid was ready to go solo. Since the kid was on his own, Torin had spent part of the day working with the builders. The Goibniu Familia had sent over a team of builders who were working on the renovations to the church, trying to turn it into a proper home. They had already constructed his forge and his laboratory building, so he spent quite a bit of time today making enchanting and alchemy tables and setting everything up. He and Hestia had even spent some time brainstorming ideas on what to call their new home once it was finished. The living quarters were supposed to be ready by the end of the month, with everything else being on the back burner until that was done. The rest of the renovation would take another month to be completed once that was finished. He'd been talking with Hestia about the few forging materials he still had from Skyrim when Belle had burst in the door, grinning like a madman, and gleefully declared that he'd promised some girl he'd eat at her restaurant the next night and that he'd been attacked by a minotaur. Torin had thought, just for a moment, that somehow Shiagarath had sent Belle into a fever dream or something. After getting Belle to calm down and explain what happened in the proper order, he finally understood. He was relieved the boy was all right and thrilled that Belle had taken his lessons to heart. Torin was honestly impressed that he had managed to cut off the Minotaur's hand, considering how strong they were supposed to be. He was definitely irritated by when he heard that Belle's armor had shattered, but that was alleviated by the fact that, after being told about it, Aina had offered to take him shopping for new armor. Torin hadn't had the time to go shopping for smithing supplies and only had a few small pieces of or left over from his forge in Skyrim. Belle's stunt with the Minotaur's hand had also badly damaged his dagger. Now Torin could do something about that. He had just enough materials to make a really nice dagger. Something that would grow with the kid. He'd made a few growth weapons before for his kids, but with Hestia here, he would need to think about it some more, but he might just be able to make something really special with what he had on hand. Hestia suddenly caught his attention. She was still sitting on Belle's back, manipulating his status, but her eyes had gone wide like dinner plates. She visibly calmed herself down and finished Belle's update. Transferring it to a sheet, she handed it to Belle. Nicely done, Belle. I guess being in danger like that gave you a bit of an extra boost. Belle looked excited as he read his status. What's this on the skill section? He asked. Oh, Hestia said. I'm sorry, my hand must have slipped. It's still empty as usual. Hestia was a good liar, but not good enough to get by him. Why don't you throw your clothes back on and go pick up something for dinner? Belle? Torin asked. He and Hestia needed to talk. You got it, Belle said as he grabbed his shirt and went running out of the door. Torin turned to Hestia, suddenly serious. What did you see? He asked. Hestia sighed. I should have guessed you'd notice something was off. She hesitated. Belle has developed a skill, but I'm not sure he should know about it. She picked up the paper again and handed it to him. Taking the status sheet, Torin read it as the hidden words became visible once again. Bell Cranel. Race human. Level 1. Strength, E403. Vit, I199. Dex, E412. AGI, D521. Mag I0. Total equals 1,535. Skills. Liaris Freeze. Increase in experience gain corresponding to the desires of the bearer. Correlates directly with the strength of the desire. Side effects. Immune to godly charms. Limit breaker. Magic, none. Torin let out a low whistle. He could see why Hestia had hidden this. Skills and effects that relied on emotion were dangerously tricky. It could easily lead to obsession or, in some cases, knowing about the skill could lead the feeling that powered it to fade, thereby leaving the skill inert. Plus, combined with his own experience gain skill, the Belle's progression would skyrocket. You were right to hide this, he said. It could be detrimental to Belle's growth if he knew about it, and downright dangerous if somebody else found out about it. Hestia looked relieved. I'm glad you agree with me, she said. Us arguing about it would tip Belle of that something was up. Speaking of Belle, She leaned back onto the couch. I don't think he should go anywhere near the dungeon for the next few days. Agreed, Torin said. He needs some time to wind down after the experience he had today. You're apparently going to dinner with him tomorrow, she said. Monsterphilia is the day after that, so we'll all be out together then. Didn't his advisor say she would take him shopping for armor? She did. The day after Monsterphilia, Torin said. That's a relief, Hestia sighed. I'm worried about his weapon though. That dagger you gave him is not looking good. I actually had an idea about that, Torin said. I'm going to work on it tomorrow, but I'll need your help. If it works, we'll never have to replace his weapon again. But didn't you say that giving him a powerful weapon would be bad for him? Torin shook his head. It won't be powerful. Not from the start, at least. Back in Tamriel, I figured out how to make weapons that grow into their power with their wielder. I made them for my children, and the weapons grew in strength as they did. If you help me though, I think I can make one even better than the ones I gave them. How? She seemed intrigued. What would you need me to do? There are few things as powerful as the blood of a god, Torin said. I have quicksilver, ebony, and powdered dragonbone which I can use for the metals, but a single drop of your blood during the forging process and another during the quenching could make something really special. We could bind it so that only members of your familia could ever use the blade. For anybody else, it would be like trying to fight with a dry twig. Hestia looked excited. Are you sure this will work? She asked. I'm certain I can get it right, but I'll need your help. Bell can hold things and be my assistant while I work. When Bell returned with dinner, the two told him about their plans. To say Bell was thrilled beyond belief was an understatement. You will still need to go with Aina to find new armor though, Torin told him. I haven't gotten the materials to make armor yet, and this process doesn't work for armor anyway. Bell said he had no problem with that. He was just thrilled to be getting such a cool weapon. The next morning, Torin stood in his forge, staring at the glowing coals. Hestia stood to the side, looking nervous. Bell was standing at the door, watching the sky. It was his job to shout at the very second the sun peeked out over the horizon. That was one of the tricks to working with ebony. It didn't matter how long the forging took, but the process had to begin as the sun rose. Trying to begin the process at any other time would leave it brittle and useless. He had sworn both Bell and Hestia to secrecy about the technique he was about to use. It was one he had created, and that didn't want any information leaking. Torin had already been up for some time prepping the materials, carving the handle and stoking his forge. He had already spot-welded the billet he was going to use and attached a rod, careful not to allow anything hot to directly touch the ebony within the billet. The ebony was encased by the quicksilver, but the color and durability would come out during the forging process. He would be using powdered dragon bone from Tamriel as flux during the forge welding. Bell's cry rang from the door. Sucking in a deep breath, Torin let out, Mul Qhdiv, and plunged the billet into the coals as the flickering armor of dragon aspect formed around him. Bell frantically ran over and began to pump the larger bellows. Dragon aspect, while primarily a combat shout, and his trump card at that, had an interesting secondary effect. It allowed him to draw out what little divine energy flowed through his body. An energy he slowly pushed through his hands, into his hammer and down the rod into the billet that had begun to glow in the forge. He stared as Bell furiously pumped the bellows, watching the billet. Finally, he drew it out and placed it on his anvil. Hestia stepped close and, pricking her finger, allowed a single drop of blood to fall onto the molten metal. Before the steam could rise, Torin poured the dragon bone flux over the billet and struck it 3 times with the hammer before plunging it back into the forge and pouring as much energy as he could into the metal. Now began the difficult but normal process of forge welding. Torin would draw the billet from the forge and strike, fusing the metals together before placing it back into the forge before it could get too cold. It was a long process, but eventually, as dragon aspect faded, the billet was done, and the shaping could begin. Cutting off the guiding rod, Torin quickly formed the tang before focusing on the blade. Torin struck methodically, years of practice ensuring that each strike was perfectly placed and with just enough power as he formed the blade. A straight spine with a single edge that curved at the tip. It was almost noon by the time Hestia stepped forward again. Pricking her finger, she let a single drop fall into the oil bath, just as Torin plunged the glowing metal into the quench. Golden flames sparked and flew from the point of contact. Holding for just a moment, Torin pulled the blade from the bath and placed it upright in his vise, held by the tang. He stared, searching for any sign of cracking or warping as steam rolled off the now darkened blade. It was perfect. All that was left now was to attach the handle, sharpen and polish the blade. Carefully heating the tang, Torin drew it down into the blackened dragon bone handle he had carved and wrapped in Dremora leather. That finished, he took the blade to his grinding wheel to ensure it was sharpened and polished. When at last it was done, Torin lifted the blade to examine it. It was gorgeous. one of his greatest creations. Across the dark blade were characters in Dovizil and ancient Aurarian runes, forming Hestia's name as they danced across the spine. He stood, wiping sweat from his brow, and slowly handed the blade to Bell. This blade bears the blood and the name of Hestia, goddess of hearth and home. Treat it well, and with respect, and it will always lead you home. Bell took the Hestia knife, reverently. As his hands closed over the hilt, the runes flashed, and for a moment the blade seemed to glow as the weapon bound itself to him. That evening, despite the fact that Bell had been almost conned into coming here, Torin was looking forward to sitting down at this tavern he was being dragged to and having a meal. The forging process had taken most of the day and had left him drained. He'd be fine by morning, but right now he was hungry. As they entered the hostess of fertility, Torin spied the silver-haired girl Bell had told him about. Spotting them, she rushed over and greeted Bell. "Hi, Seer," Bell said. "This is my teacher, Mr. Torin. He's the other member of my familia I told you about." "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," the girl said happily. Torin had barely returned the sentiment before Seer had dragged them over to the bar and started bustling about. Torin's voice pulled her to a stop. "We'll have 2 of the specials." He gestured to the board on the wall and dropped several coins on the counter. "Some mead for me and keep it coming. Plus, whatever the kid wants to drink." "Ha!" A booming voice came from the dwarf woman behind the bar. "I like a customer who knows what he likes." She walked up to them. "So, you're the kid who spilled poor Seer's dinner," she said, addressing Bell, who could only nod. He seemed a bit frightened. She looked to Torin. "Ain't seen you before. You the kid's babysitter." Torin laughed and she plunked a tankard in front of him. He liked this woman. She reminded him of Orgner after Delphine had finally sold him the inn. "I'm his mentor, Torin of the Hestia Familia. The kid is Bell." "I take it you're the owner of this place?" he asked. "That's right. The name's Mia, but most call me Mama or Mama Mia." Torin raised his tankard. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mia," he said. He and Bell spent the next little while eating and chatting with Mama Mia and Seer when she had a moment to spare. They were about halfway through their meal when the door was pushed open and a large party came through, led by a petite redhead in an outfit that really didn't work with her physique. Who are they?" he heard Bell ask. Turning, he noticed Bell was staring, transfixed at the blonde at the back of the party. Seer answered him as the group got themselves settled at a table and called out their orders. "That's the Loki Familia. They're one of the top 2 familias in the city. The redhead is Goddess Loki. So this was the Loki Familia. That would mean that the blonde woman was Ace Wallenstein, the girl who'd saved Bell's life yesterday. He needed to make sure Bell thanked her for that before they left. Turning back to the counter, they continued to eat and chat, having a pretty good time overall. Unfortunately, it was interrupted by the werewolf of the Loki Familia's extremely drunken voice rising up over the crowd. "Oi, Sage, don't you think you should tell everybody about what happened yesterday? Ha! It was show funny." Torin looked over. The werewolf was practically falling over in his seat. They hadn't been there for more than 20 minutes. How was he so drunk already? Lightweight. Torin scoffed in his mind as he drained his tankard. He was a Nord. Nords had no respect for someone who couldn't hold their booze. The golden-haired girl spoke up. "What are you talking about, Bet?" she asked. "Come on, you know. The tomato kid. The lil wimp WH the Minotaur." The drunken werewolf replied. Torin watched as Ace's eyes went hard and she glared at the werewolf. The green-haired elf was also glaring, and the red-headed goddess had gone quiet. The others at the table were looking away, embarrassed. Torin could feel Bell about to bolt and put a hand on his shoulder, holding him in his seat. "So Naiway," the drunken fool continued. "Thizen Minotaur runs away from us and up to the 5th floor, right? And it finds Th's wimpy lil dork. The lil prick don't even try to fight, he just runs, screaming. Show Ace swoops in and saves him. And this lil wimp gets completely covered in blood. And, looking like a FCKN tomato. Then, he just runs away screaming from the one that saved him." The fool howled with laughter, oblivious to the fact that nobody at his table or around the room was laughing with him. The few who might have, sufficiently cowed by the icy glares Ace and the green-haired elf were directing at the werewolf. "Thu lil bastardy must have pissed his pants." The werewolf howled with laughter again. "That's not what happened, Bet," Ace said, firmly. "Ha!" the werewolf said, glaring. The green-haired elf spoke up. The young man in question had to have been a level 1. He did very well to survive at all. "You were doing nothing but embarrassing yourself. Acting like this. Bet." "Shut it, hag!" the now-named Bet shouted. Ace spoke up again. "He did more than just survive, Reveria. He managed to wound the Minotaur before it caught him." "Oh," the elf looked intrigued. "How badly?" "He managed to cut off one of its hands." If he'd been able to dodge that last blow, he may have even won. The elf and several others at the table looked impressed. Suddenly, the red-headed goddess spoke up. Nearly beating a minotaur at level 1 is pretty damn impressive. I don't remember you doing anything nearly so cool when you were a level 1. Bet. Is somebody feeling jealous? The goddess teased. The werewolf bristled with anger, oblivious to the dwarf of the group standing up to move behind him. Bet stood and slammed his hand down on the table, cracking it down the center. Shoot up, you lil. He was unable to finish his sentence as the dwarf brought his armored fist down on the fool's head, knocking him cold. Goddess Loki raised a hand. Sorry about that, everybody. The lightweight doesn't know when to quit. Mia, send us a bill for the table, will ya? Torin continued to observe the Loki familia as the dwarf dragged the unconscious werewolf out of the tavern. Overall, he was impressed by their attitudes. Bell was being very quiet, but he supposed that was to be expected. He had gone from being insulted by a drunk to being defended by the very person who had saved his life. That was probably a bit much to deal with at once for him. Bidding their farewells to Mamma Mia and Seer, Torin guided Bell out and back down the road towards the church. They could both use some sleep. Babble. Freya stared down at the city in fascination. She had found something truly wonderful. She stared, enraptured, as the older of the two led the younger down the street. Their souls were marvelous. One shone with a unique, golden light. She could almost feel Akatosh's power radiating from it. How fascinating. But the other? Oh, the other. She had never seen a soul that shone so brightly, so purely. Oh yes, she thought to herself. She had found something truly marvelous indeed. Chapter 7. Torin. The morning following their encounter with the drunken werewolf was hectic as they scrambled to prepare for the Monsterphilia celebrations. Torin was fascinated by the idea of monster taming. It had been attempted several times in Tamriel's history but with very little success, so it would be interesting to see the process they used here. Bell, it seemed, had recovered from his embarrassment over the events of the night before as he let Hestia talk his ear off about all the things she wanted to do. The two of them were clearly more interested in the myriad stalls and limited time shops or items that would be around during the celebration. Part of their excitement was due to the fact that they had ample money to spend at the festival. After a long conversation during their first week about how the Familia would be handling money, it had been agreed that Torin would pay for the renovations and, for a limited time, food and other necessities. Those expenses would eventually be taken over by the slowly growing Familia Fund. They had decided that Bell and all future members of the Familia would put 10% of their daily earnings into the Familia Fund. Hestia had been adamant about contributing to their funds and had initially gotten a job at a rather popular food stall, but Torin didn't think that was dignified for a goddess, so, spying an investment opportunity, he had given Hestia the funds needed to buy the food stall and several others around the city. As owner, Hestia earned a cut of the profits each stall made. 10% of her weekly profits would go into the Familia Fund, 20% was going towards paying Torin back for his initial investment, but the rest was for Hestia herself to spend. She had already made enough to buy a few decent things to expand her wardrobe and was giddy at the thought of how much money her stalls would make at Monsterphilia. She had even branched out and decided to invest in the shop of a fellow god. Apparently Mayak, a friend of Hestia's, was a god who ran a mid-level potioneering and healing familia that had fallen on hard times. While successful, they had incurred heavy debts from Dien sect when trying to replace their captain's missing arm, and most of the familia members had abandoned them. Hestia invested in their store, wanting to help Mayak get back on his feet and, after meeting Mayak, Torin had approved. Having an in with a skilled alchemist and healer was always a good thing, and Mayak seemed like a good man. Bell, on the other hand, had been saving his money ever since their first day in the dungeon, so it had grown to a reasonable size. He had put away half of his earnings to pay for his new armor, but the rest was available for him to use however he wished. As a kid from a rural farming village, he had never attended a festival anywhere near the size of Monsterphilia and was very excited to see what it had to offer. Leaving around mid-morning, the trio made their way towards the Colosseum on the other side of the city. Most of the stalls and decorations for the event had been set up around it since the monster taming was the main event. Torin smiled to himself as they walked through the festival grounds. It had been many years since he had last attended a festival, with the last being the celebrations following the coronation of Elisif's great-grandson as High King of Skyrim. Torin separated from Hestia and Bell at the entrance to the festival market area. The two of them enthusiastically browsing through the stalls while he headed straight for the Colosseum. The Colosseum itself reminded him of the grand arena in the Imperial City, though the layout was rather different. Finding himself a decent seat, Torin watched with interest as the Ganesha Familia prepared to bring out the first monster. Ganesha is a very strange god. Torin thought to himself as Ganesha announced the start of the taming. He seemed very self-absorbed, shouting, "I am Ganesha," at the end of every sentence, but he was a very good showman. His introduction got the crowd excited, and they were probably used to his eccentricities. Torin leaned forward in his seat as the first tamer unlocked the cage containing a monster boar. Monsterphilia had begun. Bell was very excited as he and Goddess Hestia went browsing from stall to stall. They had mostly stopped at food stalls so far, and he had been enthralled by all the new and exotic foods that were being sold. He'd never even heard of half of these, and they were all delicious. He and Hestia had decided to spend the morning going through the festival market, trying all the different foods, and browsing through the souvenirs on display at the booths set up around the Colosseum. After noon, they would head to the Colosseum to catch the second half of the monster taming. Mr. Torin had been very interested in seeing the monsters brought up from the dungeon and whether or not the members of the Ganesha Familia could really tame them, so he had gone straight to the Colosseum after they had arrived. Bell was pulled from his thoughts when Goddess Hestia grabbed his hand and pulled him towards another stall. Massive smiles plastered across both of their faces as they enjoyed the festivities. Freya. She stood in the preparation area beneath the Colosseum staring at a cage. Members of the Ganesha Familia stood across the hall, charmed into mindless obedience and forgetfulness as she had passed them by. Such silly children, she thought, barely worth my time. A smile stretched across her face as her eyes flashed, pulling the monstrous ape in the cage under her spell. The beast would make a fine test for the younger of her new playthings. She had already seen him running around the grounds with that little snit, Hestia. Her eyes flashed again as she gave the monster its target. She wondered how his soul would change if it managed to kill his goddess. Then again, him succeeding in besting the monster would be just as entertaining. She could barely wait to see the results. She turned away, silently commanding her charmed drones to break open the other monster cages after she had left. The chaos would be thrilling. Torin. Well, this has certainly been entertaining, Torin thought, as he watched a member of the Ganesha Familia try to ride an infant dragon. The monster taming had been fun to watch, though not terribly effective. The tamers had managed to train several lower-level monsters to do various things, but the monsters would still attack anyone that wasn't their tamer without warning. They would even occasionally attack the tamer even after they had been successfully tamed. Torin had spent decades attuning himself to dangerous situations, honing his senses to ensure he could never be ambushed. So when sudden sense of foreboding passed over him, he paid full attention to it. Something was wrong. Torin was sure of it as looked around, trying to find the source of the feeling. He spotted the Amazon twins and one of the elves from the Loki Familia making their way out of the stands, concerned looks on their faces. Turning towards the announcer's box, he could see Ganesha speaking frantically with members of his familia. Something has definitely gone wrong, he thought as he stood from his seat, making his way out of the stadium. Lafia tried not to panic as she ran through the streets of Ororio, following Ms. Tioni and Ms. Tiona. After noticing that something was wrong, they had made their way out of the stadium and found Goddess Loki. Their goddess had, alarmingly, informed them that a large number of monsters had escaped and were rampaging through the streets. Goddess Loki had already sent Ms. Ace to destroy as many as she could. Determined to help Ms. Ace, Lafia had followed Ms. Tioni and Ms. Tiona as they had rushed off to help stop the rampaging monsters. Despite having no weapons, Ms. Tioni and Ms. Tiona were level 5 and more than strong enough to handle most monsters barehanded. Lafia was only level 3 and nowhere near as confident in her ability to help. As a mage, she could cast her magic without her staff, so she promised herself that she would do her best to help them. The three of them ran into one of the market areas just in time to see Ms. Ace destroy the last of the monsters that had been smashing up the stalls in the courtyard. Ms. Ace is amazing, Lafia said, resting her hands on her knees. At this point, we won't even get a chance to fight, Ms. Tioni said, disappointed. Shall we leave it to Ace today, then? Ms. Tiona asked, her hands behind her head. Perhaps we should, Lafia said. If Ms. Ace really had it handled that well, they should probably stay out of her way. We didn't even bring our weapons or anything. Lafia was cut off by a rumbling sound before a strange creature burst out of the ground, towering over the nearby buildings. It was a single long green tendril with some kind of pointed head, which it used to start smashing stalls and buildings. The bottom of its body was still embedded in the ground. What is that thing? Some kind of snake? Ms. Tiona asked, running towards it. I've never seen anything like it before, Ms. Tioni answered, running as well. Where did those Ganesha guys even find this thing? Ms. Tiona shouted as she dodged one of its attacks. We need to stop it, Ms. Tioni shouted back. Lafia, start chanting. Right, Lafia replied, backing away as the twins barreled towards the monster and, jumping into the air, brought their fists down on the monster's long neck, slamming it into the ground. Ms. Tioni cried as they sprang back up. Gods, that's hard, Ms. Tiona yelled as she pulled away from the monster. What the hell is this weird thing? I wish we had our weapons, Ms. Tioni said, dodging another attack. Lafia stood back, preparing her chant. A full power chant might destroy part of the city, but a shorter one would allow her to control her power output and react faster. Unleash a streak of light, bow and arrow of the holy tree. Lafia began her chant. Thou art a master of the bow. Fire, O elven archer. May your arrow strike true. The monster suddenly turned towards her. It was reacting to her magic. A sudden cracking sounded, and a tendril burst from the ground, knocking Lafia into the air. Landing on a shattered stall, Lafia let out a gasp of pain as she felt something pierce her side. Lafia! The twins cried. The snake monster's head suddenly opened, blooming to show a mouth filled with gnashing teeth. That thing is a flower? Miss Tiona screamed. 7 more flower monsters suddenly sprung from the ground, tangling up the twins as they tried to rush to Lafia. Ms. Tioni's voice rang out. Lafia, are you all right? We could use some help over here, Ms. Tiona yelled. No, I'm doing it again, Lafia thought, her side screaming in pain. One of the plant monsters was looming over her, teeth gnashing. I know. She'll come and rescue me again. Ms. Ace will. A blade slashed through the plant monster, destroying it, and a figure dropped to the ground in front of Lafia, but it definitely wasn't Ms. Ace. The figure was an older human man with dark hair and an ethereal sword in his hand. The blade vanished as he turned towards Lafia. Are you all right? He asked as he approached her. Lafia tried to answer but could only cry out in pain as her side flared up. Lafia! There was Ms. Ace, the wind of her tempest spell dissipating as she landed. I've got her, the human said. They need your help more right now. He gestured towards the twins. They were definitely having trouble. One of the plant monsters had Miss Tioni by the ankle and another had Miss Tiona's wrist caught in its jaws. Ms. Ace nodded at the human. Tempest! She incanted. Wind surged around her legs, and she rushed off to help the others. The human pulled Lafia from the wreckage. She grit her teeth as her side flared up again. Hold still, I've got you, he said. He turned away, waving his hand and, to Lafia's astonishment, a domed magical shield sprang up around them. The human turned to her again, his fist clenched. A strange glow was emanating from the closed hand, the same greenish-blue color as the magical shield. One of the plant monsters slammed a tendril against the dome, eliciting a grunt from the human. The dome didn't so much as budge. He raised his other hand and once again Lafia was astonished as, without a word, a glowing golden magic sprang from the man's outstretched hand and enveloped her. Lafia gasped as a wave of relief washed over her. The pain was gone. She could feel her wound closing. After barely a moment, she felt even better than she had before she'd been hit. She stood. Thank you for your help, she said gratefully. My pleasure, he said. The man turned to look at the battle. They need help, he said. Lafia turned as well. He was right. Ms. Ace was caught in one of the plant monster's jaws and the twins were tangled up in the tendrils of the others. I'm going to give them a hand, the man said. Start chanting again the moment the ward falls. Lafia nodded. She would not fail again. The man readied himself. Now, he shouted. The shield fell and the human bolted forward. Lafia raised her hands and began to chant. Torin. Torin dashed away from the elf girl he had healed, summoning another bound sword as he did. Jumping over a sweeping tendril he shouted. Fik Losa. A phantom doppelganger was summoned into being and sprinted to the left, grabbing the focus of several of the strange plants. Torin ran right and leapt into the air, his bound sword slashing through the tendrils holding the Amazon girls. The two landed on their feet and, shouting thanks over their shoulders, jumped back into the fray. Wallenstein had managed to free herself, using the hilt shard of her broken sword to kill the monster that had been trying to eat her. She too jumped back into the fray. There were now 6 of the plant monsters remaining. Torin could probably destroy them quickly with a full power shout, but with all the chaos, there was too much of a chance he would catch the other fighters in the crossfire. Torin drew one of the 2 daggers sheathed at his waist, a pair of nice, sturdy blades of Nordic design. While he never went about unarmed, he rarely carried his best daggers like the blade of Woe or Kavazian's Fong during day-to-day activities. Torin leapt over a slashing tendril. Heads up! He hollered and threw the dagger towards the Amazon twins. The longer-haired twin caught it by the handle. Thanks! She called out, slashing at a tendril that was trying to wrap around her torso. Torin bounded off a low tendril and lopped the gnashing bulb off the top of one of the plants. The monster exploded into dust as Torin landed, back to back with the shorter-haired Amazon twin. Catch! He called, tossing his second dagger up and over his head. Got it! He heard the girl call as he dashed away from her. He had to admit to himself as he ducked under the winding tendrils of another monster. He was having fun, even though this was definitely not how the festival was supposed to go. Lafia. Lafia continued her chant as she watched the battle. The human who had saved her was an impressive fighter in addition to apparently being a healer. He was moving with even more confidence and grace than Ms. Ace and the twins, and had killed 2 of the monsters, with only 5 now remaining. With her elf ring surrounding her, Lafia neared the end of her chant and raised her voice high as a signal to the others. "My name is Alf. Win Fimblevetcher." A massive burst of icy wind swirled from her hands, blowing towards the plant monsters. Lafia's companions and the human all jumped out of the path of the spell. The icy wind froze the monsters in place. Lafia let out a sigh of joy. She had done it. She had finished her chant and helped defeat the monsters. Crack! Lafia looked up, shocked. 2 of the monsters at the far end of the battle had started to move again. Her chant had been too short. The spell hadn't kept enough energy to completely freeze the monsters farthest from her. Lafia raised her hands to frantically begin the chant again when the human jumped forward. He took a deep breath and let out a thunderous call. "Fo crack die." A blast of icy wind flew from the human's mouth, freezing the 2 monsters even more solidly than the ones Lafia had caught with her spell. Barely a second after they had been caught in the strange spell, the 2 monsters shattered into a million pieces. Ms. Ace and the others dashed forward again to destroy the monsters Lafia had frozen. As they smashed up the frozen plants, Lafia stared at the strange human. First, he had saved her with an ethereal sword, then he had made a magic shield, and then he had healed her, all without a word or an incantation. Following that, he had proceeded summon a strange doppelganger with a loud shout. Next, he went on to fight even better in melee combat than Lafia's level 5 companions, even arming 2 of them with his own weapons. Finally, he had used another strange shout to release a spell that was even more powerful than the one Lafia had spent most of the battle charging up. Who, in the name of all the gods, was this human? Bell. Bell was running for his life, dragging Goddess Hestia along behind him. He and his goddess had been happily browsing the stalls when a series of terrified screams rent the air. Bell had looked around frantically, trying to find out what had happened, when he heard a loud thump behind him. He had turned, slowly, to see a massive ape-like monster with red eyes staring down at him and Goddess Hestia. A silverback, his memory provided. Bell and Mr. Torin had come across them during their research into the dungeon. They were ape-like monsters that spawned on the 11th and 12th floors. Bell had no time to wonder about why there was a silverback on the surface. Later, logic would provide that it must have escaped from the Ganesha Familia, but now was no time for logic. The silverback had raised its massive palm to strike. Now was the time for screaming and running for his life. Bell had bolted away as fast as his legs would carry him, Goddess Hestia practically being dragged through the air behind him. They ran through the streets, ducking under debris and around other terrified festival-goers. The other monsters in the street set about attacking whatever was nearest. The many adventurers in the crowd were drawing their weapons or grabbing makeshift ones from the debris and had begun to fight back. The silverback ignored all of this. It clearly had its eyes set on Bell and Hestia, and there was nothing that would stand in its way. It chased the 2 of them through the streets and smashed its way through the alleys. They ducked down in a frantic attempt to lose it until at last they barreled into an empty courtyard. There was nowhere left to go. The only way out that was unblocked was the way they had come in, and the silverback was bearing down on them. Bell was having flashbacks. Just 2 days ago he had been in this exact situation. Stranded in a dead end, facing an overwhelming opponent, with nowhere else to go. This time was different though. This time Goddess Hestia was in danger. This time he had the Hestia knife, a weapon that was guaranteed to be unbreakable. A weapon whose single-edged black blade extended nearly the full length of his forearm and whose straight, lethal edge curved to a point at the tip of the blade. He had stood in his teacher's forge, pumping the bellows upon command, watching as Mr. Torin had forged this weapon. For him, his teacher had forged this weapon with the blood of the very goddess who he would now defend, and he would not let either of them down. Bell pointed to a drainage ditch off to the side of the empty square. "Hide there, goddess," he yelled, turning and drawing his knife. "Be careful, Bell," she cried, running towards the ditch. She had only just slid under cover when the silverback smashed its way into the yard. The brute still had restraints that, when held in a cage, would work to keep the beast in place. Unfortunately, now that it was loose, they acted more like armor. Bell dove to the side, dodging a piece of debris the ape had thrown at him. Rolling, Bell sprang back up and sped towards the silverback. Speed was his friend here. He had learned from the Minotaur that speed was the key to besting larger opponents. Get in, score a hit, and get out before the brute could catch him. Bell did just that, springing off the ground and slashing at the chains that held the silverback's makeshift armor in place. The Hestia knife cut through the chains like butter, removing the armor and scoring a deep cut across the silverback's chest. Bell retreated, trying to figure out the best possible angle of attack while the monster screamed in pain. Noticing the clotheslines hanging across the small square, he raced towards the wall. Springing up and kicking off the wall, Bell used his momentum to turn the clothesline into a makeshift bowstring. Bell aimed as he soared into the air. Finally, tension and gravity brought him crashing back down, and he rammed his knife deep into the silverback's skull. Bell collapsed to the ground as the monster exploded into dust. I did it, he thought. I won. As the adrenaline faded, he dimly registered Goddess Hestia hugging him in relief. Torin. Torin knelt on the ground, scooping up the magic stone of one of the strange plant monsters. It looked different than the ones he had seen before, but he didn't know enough about them to be sure if it was something to be concerned about. Hearing footsteps, he looked up to see Aina, along with another member of the guild, rushing into the square. Also walking towards them, from the other side of the square and holding the hand of a small child, was the red-headed goddess Loki. What's the situation looking like, Lil Aina? Loki asked. All of the rampaging monsters have been dealt with. This was the last location with reported combat, and so far, there have been no reported fatalities. Aina said, breathlessly, as she stopped near them. That was a relief. He had been running around the area killing monsters and looking for Bell for quite some time before stumbling across the plant monsters and the wounded elf. Speaking of the elf, she was walking towards him. She bowed low, a custom of this world, apparently, and said, "Thank you very much for healing me, sir, and for helping with the battle." "Yeah, thanks for the help, man," the shorter-haired of the Amazon twins interjected as she jogged over, followed by her sister. Aina and the other official were speaking with Wallenstein and Loki. "The daggers were a big help," the longer-haired twin said, handing the dagger back. Her sister did the same. "I'm glad I was able to help," Torin said as he took the daggers back, sheathing them at his waist again. "What was with that cool glow sword you summoned?" the shorter-haired twin asked. "It was so cool, and it cut up those monsters like butter." "It's a magic skill I possess," Torin said simply. "I wish I could summon a glowy version of my Urga. That would be so cool," she said, excitedly. Torin didn't know what an Urga was, but he guessed it was her weapon. He turned as Goddess Loki walked towards him. "Thanks for helping my kids today," she said. "Ace said you fixed up Lafia with healing magic and were a big help during the fight." "I was just in the right place at the right time," Torin said. "What familia are you with?" Loki asked. "I don't recognize you, but you're clearly quite strong." "The Hestia familia," he replied. "Hestia?" She sounded surprised. "I thought that the Lil Bit only had one member, some kid at level 1. "Technically, she does," Torin said. "His name is Bell. He is her only active adventurer. I'm semi-retired and Bell is my student." "Really? What's your name?" the goddess asked. "Torin." She shook her head. "No, not that name. Your alias. You're clearly strong, and if you're retired, you must have been given an alias." She stared at him. "I don't remember you, but your energy feels familiar." "No, wait, that's a god's energy. Your previous familia." She scrunched up her forehead in thought. "I'm new to Orario," Torin said, "and I'm afraid I'll need Goddess Hestia's approval if I'm to answer any of your other questions." "Well now," Loki was staring again. "The gods were supposed to have a party tomorrow to end the festivities. If that's still on, I'll just have to ask Hestia about you. Still, thank you again for helping my kiddos." "It was my pleasure," Torin said before turning to walk back towards the Colosseum. He still needed to find Bell and Hestia to make sure they were all right. Freya. Staring down at the city as the sun went down, Freya smiled. The chaos had ended a few hours ago, but cleanup crews were still moving about the city. Her plan had been a smashing success. So entertaining. While it may have been more fun if her young plaything had failed, seeing him succeed was almost as good. Chapter 8. Aina. Those unused to a city like Orario would likely assume that the day following a disaster like the one that had occurred during Monsterphilia would be filled with builders and officials rushing about and trying to figure out who was responsible and how much it would cost to rebuild. They would be wrong. Orario was a city of adventurers where 1 in 5 members of the population had the strength to destroy public property just by becoming distracted, and weird things happened in the street every single day. Orario had one of the best disaster relief policies in the world. Barely an hour after the last of the fighting had ended, the cleanup and recovery crews had assembled and begun their work. Members of the guild had begun investigating the cause of the incident before the fighting had even ended. Unfortunately, none of the Ganesha Familia members who had been guarding the cages could remember what happened. Several gods who sometimes helped the guild with various matters participated in the questioning to ensure that the guards were telling the truth. After all, it was impossible to lie to a god. Most would think that even with a decent disaster relief program, it would be all hands on deck at the guild. They would be wrong again. Aina was actually taking the day off and nobody had a problem with it. Everything was handled and business could proceed as normal. Aina stood near the fountain in front of Babel Tower, waiting for Bell to show up. Adventurers and supporters who were looking to form temporary parties would often congregate around the fountain, and there were already quite a few milling about as she stood there. Aina was so proud of Bell. He'd been caught up in the fighting and had actually managed to best a silverback. Not only that, but he hadn't charged in like an idiot trying to be a hero. He tried to escape a monster that should have been far too powerful for him and had only turned to fight when he had no choice. It was a little upsetting that this was the second time he'd done that, but she was still proud. After the first incident, Aina had promised to take Bell to buy new armor, and the day had finally come to do so. She knew he'd been saving his money for quite a while, so she was hopeful that he could afford some decent armor. He should probably find a supporter too, Aina thought as she watched a party form off to her left. She would need to recommend that to him once they were done. Bell was positively buzzing with excitement as he followed Ms. Aina into the Hephaestus Familia shop. He was actually going to buy good armor. Mr. Torin had stressed that armor at his level was one of the most important things an adventurer could have, so he was ready to take that step. While only the best of the best would be on display or sold in the main store and other primary displays, there were other counters and shops towards the back that sold armor from lower-level smiths. It was from these shops that most lower-level adventurers bought their armor. Mr. Torin had told Bell that most adventurers formed at least a partial contract with a smith before they hit level 3, so most of the people who bought from shops like the ones in the back were level 1 or 2. Bell and Ms. Aina split up as they entered the slightly dusty shop. He'd spent several hours talking with Mr. Torin about what kind of armor he should look for, and together they had concluded that light plate armor was what would suit him best. This was harder to find than one might think. Most light armor wasn't even made of metal at all, as it tended to be made of hardened leathers. Any metal found in light armor would be chainmail or done in a brigandine style. Mr. Torin had said that plate was usually reserved for medium or heavy armor, and as he browsed, Bell found himself agreeing with that. After finding a set that was in his price range, Bell would pick up the chest plate. If the plate was too heavy, he would have to put it back, and so far, he hadn't found any that were light enough. It must have been nearly an hour before Bell stumbled across a box hidden on a low shelf. Inside were pieces of silver plate armor with red accents. The box read Pionkichi Mk2 by Welf Kratzo, V9, 900. That was well within Bell's price range, and he was thrilled to discover just how light it was once he picked up the chest plate. Ms. Aina, he called though the shop. She was browsing the other side of the store, trying to find anything that might fit him. Did you find something, Bell? She asked as she came over. Look at this, he said, showing her the armor. It's in my price range, and it's definitely light enough. He knocked on it with his knuckle and tried to bend it. It seems sturdy enough too. Mr. Torin said he wanted to look at whatever I buy before I use it in the dungeon. But it seems perfect. Well, if you think that's the one you want, you should get it, Ms. Aina said with a smile. You will be returning it though, if Mr. Torin says it's no good. Bell nodded enthusiastically before rushing to the counter so he could buy his armor. Torin stared down at the steel plate with a critical eye. Bell had come rushing in about 20 minutes ago with a box of armor, begging him to examine it. Before that, Torin had been watching the builders work. Hestia had been gone for quite some time, attending a party of the gods. They would apparently have parties rather regularly to discuss the events going on in the city. Considering the reconstruction and events of the day before, they would have plenty to discuss. Torin had been impressed to discover that Ororio already had teams designated for reconstruction after any kind of disaster, and that had meant that the Goibniu Familia didn't even need to wait a day before resuming work on the renovations to the church. It was coming along nicely. It wouldn't be more than a week before they were able to move into the living space, and another month and a half before the renovation was complete. After that, they would start thinking about recruitment. It made no sense to recruit new adventurers if they had nowhere for them to live. They already had plans drawn up for expansion as well once they had enough members to warrant it. Torin tapped lightly on the plate with his hammer. It was apprentice-level work, but it was sturdy enough. The smith had been quite clever in the method he had used to keep the weight down. Judging by the set in his hands, this Welf Kratzo was probably at the same level he had been when he started his apprenticeship under Irland. Arnbjorn had gotten him started, but it was Irland Greymane who had taught him what it really took to be a smith. Torin set the armor to the side and looked at Bell, who was standing off to the side looking nervous. It looks good, Torin said, standing. It's the right size for you and it looks sturdy enough to my eye. Now we just need to see how it holds up. Bell looked confused. What do you mean? He asked. Torin smirked. I mean, go put this on and meet me in the training yard. You need to get used to wearing it, and I want to see how it holds up in combat. They had converted one of the empty lots near the church into a makeshift training yard that reminded Torin of the one out behind Jorvasker. Bell's grin was blinding as he grabbed the armor and rushed towards the church, eager to get started. Torin rolled his shoulder and grabbed one of the practice swords hanging on the wall of his forge. This would be fun. Hestia smiled as she bit into one of the hors d'oeuvres Ganesha had provided. While most godly parties were held in the evening, this one was supposed to have been to celebrate the ending of Monsterphilia and had been scheduled to begin at noon. Despite the events of the day before, the party continued as scheduled. Since nobody died, there was no point in canceling, right? The truth was the gods just loved any excuse to get together, and a disaster on top of a festival was a perfect excuse. This one was especially nice for Hestia because it was the first time she had attended one and didn't stand out because of her clothes. Before, she had barely been able to afford nice clothes for day wear, let alone a fancy dress to wear to a party like this. Now though, thanks to Torin's generosity and with her investments working out, she had been able to afford a lovely white dress with blue trim that fit in perfectly with the clothes of the other gods around her. Hestia snagged a drink from one of the trays as she moved along the upper balcony. Searching. She was looking for Hephaestus. They hadn't seen each other since Hephaestus had kicked her out, but Hestia didn't hold a grudge. Truthfully, she was grateful. Her friend had given her the kick she needed to get off her lazy ass and start a familia. Just in time, too, since it led to her meeting Bell and Torin. Hestia passed by multiple groups of gods as she walked along the balcony, sipping her drink. She caught snatches of gossip and nonsensical rumors as she did. Rakia was planning to invade again. Magic stones could be used as suppository. The elves were isolating further. Loki had offered to buy Demeter's breasts. The black dragon had been seen in the east with a bright pink bow on its head. Gods would gossip about anything, no matter how stupid it was. "Well now, don't you look lovely?" came a familiar voice. It seemed Hephaestus had found her. "Find someone new to mooch off of?" "Not at all," Hestia said, her nose in the air. "One of my children was generous enough to help me with a few investments. I bought this dress with my cut of the proceeds and have already paid him back half of what he gave me." "Really?" Hephaestus looked impressed. "It's good to see you taking some responsibility. You're also quite lucky to find a child to join you who has money. Isn't your only member a level one?" "No." Hestia shook her head and took a sip of her drink. "That's Bell. He's my only active member, and the captain, but he has a teacher. The teacher's name is Torin, and the two arrived in Orio together. Officially, Torin is retired and is spending his retirement teaching Bell and helping the familia grow. He's even funding the renovation of the church." "Really now?" Hephaestus said, intrigued. "He must be extremely skilled to have lived long enough to retire, especially if he has enough money to pay for renovations." Hestia couldn't help herself. "He's fantastic," she bragged. "Bell is a truly wonderful child and Torin has been teaching him everything he could ever wish to know. Not only that, but he is being generous with his money and even forged an incredible weapon for Bell." Hephaestus, unsurprisingly, looked very interested at that. "He's a smith." "Yes," Hestia said. "A very impressive one. Bell and I were watching while he made the knife. He needed my blood to make it and said it would grow into its power as Bell does." Hephaestus' gaze turned intense. "He's able to make growth weapons?" she asked, abruptly. Hestia was confused at the intensity. "Yes, I know he's a master smith, but is that uncommon? Even Tsubaki can't make growth weapons," Hephaestus said seriously. Hestia was shocked. "But isn't she the best smith in your familia?" she asked in a quiet voice. "Yes." Hephaestus was still very serious. "I have never met a mortal who could make growth weapons. Is he teaching your other member how to smith?" Hestia shook her head. "No. Torin is an extremely skilled fighter and is teaching Bell how to fight and be an adventurer. He told me that he only started learning to smith so that he could make his own weapons and armor." Hephaestus' jaw dropped. "You're telling me he's not a dedicated smith? How is he that good if he's focused on combat as well?" Hestia was nervous now. "Torin is unique." "Unique how? Explain." Hestia sighed. "I can't. Not here." She looked around. They were slightly isolated, but there were too many potential eavesdroppers around to say more. She'd probably said too much already. A voice cut in from behind them. "Mind if I tag along?" Hestia turned and, to her shock, saw Loki standing behind her in a black dress. "Say what?" she asked. To Hestia's even greater shock, the trickster goddess looked serious. "I met the older of your children yesterday after the fighting. He helped out several my kids who were in a tight spot. My Lil Lafia was hurt pretty bad, but he healed her with magic." Hestia's eyes widened as she remembered. Torin had mentioned the encounter the night before. "I suppose I owe you one for that, Hestia, since he's one of yours." Hestia shook her head at that. While the gods took debts very seriously, she did not consider this to be one. "You don't owe me anything," Hestia said. "I should actually thank you. One of yours, Wallenstein, saved my Bell from a minotaur in the dungeon a few days ago." Loki's eyebrows shot up. "That kid? He's one of yours." She smiled. "I guess that makes us even then. Mine saved one of yours saved one of mine." She leaned in. I still want to talk with the older one. You too. There is something about him, his energy, that I can't place. Not only that, but, judging by the battle yesterday, he is at least level 5 or 6. I can't figure out how he got that strong, and yet I've never seen or heard of him before. When I asked him, he said he would need to talk to you. Hestia hesitated. Shortly after she had invested in Mayaka's shop, she and Torin had discussed alliances. Both had agreed that the goal of their familia was to rival the familias of Loki and Freya. As Torin had pointed out though, it was next to impossible to gather that much influence overnight. Even though Torin himself was the perfect counter to military and monetary might, the Loki and Freya familias boasted impressive numbers, reputations, and wielded massive political power. They would have most of the city on their side. Freya and Loki would suffer no rivals, and the only way to gain that much power was to eliminate one of them. Doing so immediately through force of arms would only create a power vacuum since Hestia did not have the power needed to step into either of their shoes. The best way to get that much power was to form an alliance with one and work together against the other. With the aid of one, they would have a shield against the political actions of the other and would be able to build their strength in peace. Once they were strong enough, they could step up and become one of the top 2 familias in Orario. They might even be able to make Orario a safer place since the 2 strongest familias would be allied instead of antagonistic. There was always an underlying tension to the city because of the rivalry between Loki and Freya. This would eliminate that. Hestia had not even considered who to ally with, but now that she did, Loki was the better choice. While the two were almost constantly teasing each other, with Loki making comments about Hestia's height and Hestia joking about Loki's breast deficiency, there had never been any true disagreements or antagonistic feelings. If she was being honest with herself, Hestia had actually found some of Loki's antics rather hilarious, when they weren't directed at her. Freya, on the other hand, had always felt dangerous to Hestia. Her godly sphere was the home. Home is a place of love and acceptance which, technically, made Hestia the goddess of familial love. That was part of why she had never even considered shunning Hephaestus for her deformity like so many of the other Olympians. Hephaestus was her family, and she loved her. Loki, despite her penchant for being a prankster, truly cared about her family and wanted only the best for them, to see them happy and laughing. Freya though? Freya was a goddess of love, but to Hestia a better description would be obsessive love or controlling love. Freya wanted those she loved to be completely under her control and fully dependent on her attention. She was also patient, projecting an air of detached beauty as she manipulated her targets. She would treat anyone who caught her interest as a toy or a plaything, slowly breaking them down until they were practically her slaves. This behavior did not match well at all to familial love and so was almost in opposition to Hestia's own sphere. Finally, Hestia spoke up again, in a serious voice. To tell the truth, there are quite a few things I would like to talk to you about as well, Loki. Judging by her expression, Loki was surprised. Really? What are they? Hestia shook her head. Not today. I'm not ready to have either of those conversations. The renovations on my home will be finished in a little under 2 months. When they are done, I will invite you over and we can talk. Can you wait for your answers until then? Loki's stare was calculating. Finally, she spoke. I can't remember the last time you sounded so serious when you were talking to me. This must be pretty important. But you know my curiosity gets the better of me. She shook her head. 2 months. I will wait 2 months for answers. If I haven't heard from you by then, I will start digging on my own. Can you accept that? Hestia nodded. I can. I promise. Loki grinned. Well then, all this seriousness has me antsy. I'm gonna go find someone to prank. See ya, Fi-Fi. Lil bit. She walked away, mischief in her eye. Hestia grimaced at the annoying nickname. If an alliance was really possible, she would have to deal with it. What was that about? Hephaestus asked. It's nothing. Hestia shook her head. Not yet at least. You want to get out of here? We can go talk to Torin. She needed to talk to him. Anyway, considering the conversation she just had. That would have to wait, though. Hephaestus nodded. That sounds good to me, she said. Hephaestus. The sun had only just begun its descent when the rundown church she had given Hestia came into view. Make that formerly rundown church, considering it looked more like a small mansion now, with what looked like the foundations for a gated wall stretching around an area that far exceeded the lot she had originally given her friend. Hestia had gotten very lucky to find this mysterious Tauren person. The idea of a mortal being able to make growth weapons was mind-boggling. Even her captain, Tsubaki, skilled as she was, could not make them. They required a level of skill as a smith that few mortals could achieve. She wasn't ashamed to admit. She was bursting with curiosity. The sound of combat reached her ears as they entered the property. Off to the side in what looked to be a training yard, Hephaestus could see 2 figures engaged in a rigorous spar. The smaller of the 2 had white hair and was clad in what looked like light plate armor. That had to be Bell, Hestia's level 1 adventurer. The other figure was larger, with tan skin and dark hair. He was unarmored and carried what looked like a training sword. That one was definitely Torin. The two sheathed their weapons as they approached. She could hear Torin speaking to the other one. Looks like that armor will hold pretty well. You made a good choice, kid. Starting tomorrow, you've got my okay to head back into the dungeon. The one that had to be Bell sounded thrilled. Awesome. I feel so ready. Now that she had gotten a closer look, she recognized that armor. It was Welf's. She had stopped by his forge to check on him and had taken some time to observe while he had been making that armor. The kid must have bought it from her shop. That was good. Welf deserved to earn more business. She had a sudden idea. Maybe. She stared at Torin. She'd need to see him in action and have a bit of a discussion with him first, but maybe her idea would work. Is that Bell's new armor? Hestia asked as they got closer. That it is, Torin replied. We just finished testing it. It's apprentice-level work, but it will hold up well. Bell made a good choice. The man clearly had a good eye for quality and skill. She herself would consider Welf to be at the level of an apprentice, but he was a damn good one. Who's this? The man was looking at her. This is Hephaestus, her friend said. I may have mentioned Bell's knife at the party, and she wanted to see it and come meet you. The man looked intrigued. Well now, a goddess of the forge interested in my work. He smiled. Go get your knife, Bell. He gestured and the boy went running off towards what had to be a forge near the back of the property. It's a pleasure to meet you, he said, extending his hand. My name is Torin. The pleasure is mine, Hephaestus said, shaking his hand. I could barely believe it when Hestia told me you had made a growth weapon. I needed to see it for myself. With a low shout, Bell came running back up to them and, coming to a stop, handed a sheathed dagger to Hephaestus. She could tell it was a work of art before she even touched it. With a simple but sturdy sheath, and a dark red, almost black leather-wrapped handle. The moment she touched it, she could feel the energy contained within the blade. Slowly, she drew it. The inky black blade slid out. Runes and another strange script were carved along the straight blade. She held it up to the light, examining it both with her eyes and her senses as a goddess of the forge. It was definitely a growth weapon and a very powerful one at that. She wasn't certain she could make one better without her arcanum. Match it, certainly, but not surpass it. She spent several minutes inspecting the beautiful blade, asking questions of its creator, as she did until a different question popped into her head. Would you consider this to be your finest creation? Your masterpiece? That clearly made Torin stop and think for a moment. Finally, he replied, No. While this is certainly one of my best, it is not my finest. She had to know how skilled he truly was. May I see your best? Your masterpiece. Torin visibly hesitated before gesturing towards his forge. Not outside, and you will never breathe a word of what you see to another living soul. Hephaestus understood that desire all too well. I accept your terms. Torin led them into his rather impressive forge and, disappearing into a back room for a moment, returned carrying something wrapped in a black cloth. Even with the covering, she could feel the incredible power radiating from the object. Slowly, Torin unwrapped it to reveal the most beautiful scabbard she had ever seen. With a deep black color and leather-wrapped handle, gold inlay showed scenes of dragons and lightning dancing across the sheath. Torin slowly drew what was, without a doubt, the most beautiful katana she had ever seen. As it left the sheath, her senses exploded. That weapon wasn't just beautiful. It was deadly. A shiver ran up her spine. A small part of her was very afraid of that weapon, but the rest was enraptured by its appearance. This, Torin said, is Dragonbane. It was all Hephaestus could do to keep from drooling. Hestia Church. Late evening. Once Torin had put the beautiful Dragonbane away, the following hours had consisted of one of the most enlightening and most engaging discussions she had ever had. After getting over her initial shock at his origins and how he arrived in Genkai, the two had proceeded to talk shop. They had discussed materials and techniques. Torin showed off a few pieces of his, including his impressive battle armor, and she had explained the best uses of a few of the materials in this world that were new to him. The two were sitting on stools in his forge sharing a drink when, as a rather lengthy discussion on the Tamrielic enchanting method wound down, she brought up the idea that had occurred to her earlier. The smith who forged Bell's armor. Welf, she said. What do you think of his skill? Torin thought for a moment, taking a sip from his tankard. I've only seen the one piece, but he seems decent. Just from the one set, I'd put him at an advanced apprentice level. Why? Hephaestus sighed. Welf is a member of my familia, but he's stunting himself. His family are renowned for creating magical weapons of incredible power, but he refuses to make them. No matter how much money he is offered, he refuses point blank. Torin's face turned quizzical. Why? That doesn't make sense. Hephaestus took a swig before saying, he feels that a weapon that will break in its wielder's hands is unworthy. A weapon should never betray its master, and a magical weapon will always break, no matter what. At least. She paused. Magical weapons made in our style will. Torin seemed to get it. He leaned forward. But ones in the Tamrielic style won't. They are less powerful overall, but once the magic is spent, they simply need recharging, and the magic is back to full power. Exactly, Hephaestus said. I was hoping that you might consider taking Welf on as an apprentice, or at least teach him your method. It would help him grow, and maybe give him the confidence he needs to really use his talent. Torin looked surprised. An apprentice? I thought apprenticeships across familia were forbidden. Hephaestus nodded. They are. Having a training partner or forming a party with members of another familia is fine, but cross-familia apprenticeships are forbidden under the rules set by the first Donatus. You're saying you'd let Welf leave your familia? He sounded shocked. Hephaestus struggled for a moment to find the right words. I am very fond of Welf. I don't really want to let him go. But if he joins Hestia and learns from you, it could improve his skills by leaps and bounds. I want to see him improve. She sighed and drained her tankard. Once you have determined that he has learned all he can from you, I'll welcome him back with open arms. Torin sat silent for a moment. If I do this, what happens if he decides not to come back? That sent a shiver up Hephaestus' spine. She didn't want that, but if that's what he really wants, then that's okay. I would rather see him become the best smith in history in another familia than wallow in mediocrity in mine. Torin was silent once again before finally. He stood and stepped towards the weapon racks in his enchanting lab. Grabbing a beautiful golden sword off the wall, he returned and handed the weapon to Hephaestus. If she remembered their discussion rightly, the sword was done in the Dwemer style. She could feel the magic of the enchantment running through the blade. I made that as an experiment using materials I acquired in this world, Torin said. The enchantment was done using the magical stone, or rather the soul gem of a wall shadow. Gems from the upper floors are generally in the same area as petty soul gems from Tamriel. He gestured at the sword. Show that to Welf. See what he makes of it. Do not force him, though. Leave the decision up to him. If he wants to learn, I will teach him. If he wants to be my apprentice, I am sure Hestia will accept him. Bell is already wearing his armor, so maybe they can make a contract while we're at it. Hephaestus let out a sigh of relief at that. Thank you, she said. Now she just had to convince Welf that this would be a good idea. Considering his dislike of magic swords, that may take some time. Bell stood near the fountain in front of Babel, muttering nervously to himself. While they were out shopping the day before, Ms. Ina had suggested Bell find a supporter. Since she was his advisor, he would gladly follow her advice. The only problem was, he didn't know how to find one. What if he approached a supporter that looked alone, and they laughed at him? Excuse me? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Looking up, he saw a small synthrope girl wearing a huge backpack. Why, yes, Bell asked. I heard you muttering about finding a supporter. I'm looking for an adventurer to pair up with for the day, so I thought I'd ask if you wanted to partner up, she said. Bell was thrilled. Of course. I'd love to. She smiled. Great. My name is Lilaruka Arde. It's a pleasure to be working with you. Bell Cranel, he said as he shook her hand. The pleasure is all mine.